Thank you for the invitation to share my work with you. I'm just going to talk about this one project. As Toby said, I hope it's directly relevant to many of the concepts that you're talking about at the Telluride workshop. I have on purpose made very few slides with the idea that either you will interrupt me or that you can ask me questions later. And I would much rather end early rather than end late. And so we'll just go, okay? And I promise I will not take over more than the next hour of your time. Okay, so the project is deep reinforcement learning for tracking odor plumes. The motivating problem here is that I really like neuroscience and natural behavior. So I'm a computational neuroscientist. And what that really means is that I really like thinking about high-dimensional data from neural systems. And because nervous systems also produce behavior, I like thinking about behavior. And as a consequence of my job as a computationalist, I have a lot of collaborators. And it really means that since I don't have to actually run my own lab, run my own experiments, we work on a lot of different species. So here you see several of the species that we work on in the lab. We work on some flying insects, some walking insects, or a couple of bird projects that are super cool I'm not talking about today. And we have some projects on human and brain-computer interfacing as well that I'm also not talking about today. But I just wanted to give this one slide to give you an overview of what my lab does as a whole before we dive into one particular project. So I self-describe as somebody who develops data-intensive methods for understanding neural computation's underlying naturalistic behavior. The picture on the right-hand side here is actually my daughter, Abigail, who is in her natural habitat, eating spaghetti carbonara. This is actually a picture from several years ago, our first trip to Italy. We are now back in Italy, and I have a picture of her from like yesterday doing exactly the same thing, eating the same spaghetti, except she's slightly larger. That's the only difference. So she's still in her natural habitat doing her thing. I don't study my daughter. I study other humans, but I needed a picture of a human. So there she goes. The particular project I'm talking about is published. And so I would just, like I said, like all the details are in the paper. If you want to go look at it, it's all there. But I wanted to give you the high level motivation and basically open the door for conversations in terms of what are open questions, what are really cool things that we hope to be heading to next. The project was led by a former graduate student, Satprit Singh. Satprit has already defended with his PhD. He's now a postdoc at Baylor University in Houston, Texas. And our collaborators on this project are Flores van Bruegel, who is in University of Nevada in Reno, and my long-term colleague, Raj Rao, who is in computer science at the University of Washington in Seattle. I point this out here, this picture here, because I actually snuck in a watercolor that I made into the cover of this magazine. They gave me a little bit of trouble because we didn't actually study this one particular insect, but I was like, it's a point model anyway, so here we go. And they decided to put it on the cover because it's blue. So here we go. All right, so the motivating question behind this project is the ability to track odors to the source of whatever is smelly is an ancient and evolutionarily conserved behavior that's performed by basically every living thing that's motile. So bacteria do chemotaxis, small insects do this, lots of ocean organisms do this. You have hammerhead sharks that also follow odor plumes, birds follow odor plumes, humans are capable of following odor plumes. So like I said, this is a very ancient evolutionarily conserved behavior. And so we like studying it, not only because it's something strange about one organism, because this is a really algorithmically important function for living systems to have. So what you're seeing here is a picture of a strawberry. And that yellow line that you're seeing there is not actually, it's not generated by AI. It is a time-lapse photograph of one particular fruit fly as it is approaching the strawberry. The picture is taken by our friend and co-author Flores van Bruegel, who also happens to be an award-winning nature photographer. And so what you're seeing here as the fruit fly is crossing your kitchen in search of rotten fruit, on which it's going to land and lay its eggs, is this very characteristic behavioral motif that's been very well described for many, many decades. So it's doing this thing where it's casting about left and right, presumably following the odor plume, and then sometimes it heads straight for the target, and then it casts about again, okay? We describe this algorithm as the cast and surge algorithm. That's just the word for it. And it's something that's been noticed for a lot of different organisms at different size scales, including aquatic organisms, aerial organisms, and even some terrestrial organisms following terrestrial odor trails. And so here, we're focusing particularly on airborne odors, which are particularly difficult for a couple of reasons in a way that is different than following a concentration gradient in the way that like bacteria chemotaxis might. And it's also different than following terrestrial odors like, a dog following a scent on the ground, for example. So we're looking at here, again, the characteristic cast and surge behavior. Okay. Once the fly gets close enough to the target, vision actually takes over. And so for the purposes of this single project, we're not actually doing vision yet. So I'm just going to ask you to focus on the right-hand side of this diagram during the crosswind, cast, and upwind surge behaviors. So tracking odor plumes in a turbulent plume is particularly difficult. It's important for lots of things, but it's particularly difficult because the odors are intermittent. There is no trail that stays put because you can't just sniff it. And there's basically no gradient to speak of. You can't compute derivatives in space, at least. The wind direction may change unpredictably. So just because upwind at one moment is one way doesn't mean that it's that way the next moment. And the plume statistics based on the nature of the odorant could vary as well. What we're looking at on the right-hand side is a really beautiful picture from a paper that I stole from Solani et al. From 2014, where they actually did some really beautiful visualization of two odor plumes. So here they've colored it in the green and the red. And you can see that in this non-laminar turbulent plume, it very quickly becomes shredded into these strands of odor, where if you imagine yourself as a small insect flying through this odor plume, you might smell something and lose it altogether, and then smell something and then lose it altogether for a really long time. So that makes it a really, really challenging problem. I think you should be able to intuit that because we can't compute gradients in this problem, solving the task requires multisensory integration. You need to know something about the presence of the odor, but also mechanosensation to detect wind, okay? And you also need some sense of memory because the instantaneous information doesn't really give you any indication of where the odor plumes are coming from. And so even by intuition, before we derive any algorithms or do reinforcement learning, we know that something about multisensory integration has to be involved. This can't be a purely odor-driven task or a purely wind-driven task. And we need some notion of memory. Okay, those are ingredients that we already know that we are going to need. Now, I just point out here that I already talked about aerial plume tracking. Tracking terrestrial odor trails also has some characteristics in common in terms of the behavior. So we're seeing here two terrestrial organisms, a rat on the left-hand side and an ant on the right-hand side, that are both following an odor trail that's been laid down on the ground. So this is real data from those two papers that I'm citing directly. And what you're seeing there are these two organisms as they're doing, even though the odor trail is on the ground and it's not moving, the animals are still doing a version of the cast and surge behavior where they're sniffing. In this case, they both have, the rats have two nostrils, the ants have two antennas. They're going left and right. And once they identify the odor trail, they'll follow it for a little bit until they lose it. And then they'll go left and right again in order to localize the position of the odor plume. So this kind of cast and surge behavior seems to be at a different scale, very general, and something that lots and lots of animals use as well. Now, understanding the neural basis of this behavior is quite challenging because even though we have lots and lots of tools for measuring neural activity in insects and in Drosophila in particular, I'm going to make the categorical statement that it is still actually impossible to track animal behavior of a fruit fly over meters to kilometers and simultaneously measure their neural behavior at the same time. We can do both of these experiments separately, but it's pretty much impossible to do them at the same time. Okay, so this is where kind of modeling and normative approaches like reinforcement learning come in my motivation is to bridge that gap between these two different types of experiments, behavioral experiments and neural experiments that we can do, and basically bring the whole thing and closing the loop by building the agent-based model so that we can actually have full control over the behavior as well as opening the black box of what's happening in the neural dynamics on the inside. This is a work in progress, but I just did want to show that our collaborators are probably some of the folks who have led the way in terms of doing the behavioral experiments. Flores, along with our friend Michael Dickinson, built these wind tunnels that are, again, order a meter long, which is quite large for a fruit fly. I mean, they're like a couple of millimeters. You've seen them in your kitchen. You might even have them in the back of the room right now if you have bananas back there. And they were able to track the 3D kinematics of these fruit flies as they're flying into this wind tunnel. They also did this really heroic experiment in this long distance dispersal. They went to the desert outside Los Angeles, drove into the middle of the desert, into this really, really flat area, big open desert, completely featureless desert, released just a gazillion fruit flies in the middle, and then had a ring of traps about a kilometer away from where they released the flies, and then caught them. And so there's a beautiful set of papers that they wrote to doing that. I think, Toby, you must know Michael, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so the picture down here is this is Michael Dickinson with his nose full of flies. So in case you've ever wanted to look like wonder what Michael looks like when his nose is full of flies, that's what he looks like at the release.
What's that blue thing on the left? Is that one of those camera traps? The blue thing, that box.
This box right here?
Yeah.
I think that's the transportation box.
Okay. Oh, I see.
Yeah, they got a lot of flies, put them in boxes, and drove them in an SUV into the desert.
I see.
Katie Litch was the first author on this paper. It was a fun experiment. I wish I had been there. Okay, nevertheless, there's these really cool experiments. And so we have a lot of information about behaviorally what flies are capable of doing in terms of following these very long distances and tracking odors for long distances. But we have absolutely no idea what's going on in their brain when they're doing this. And so anything that is anything that's going to be opening up the black box into the neurocomputation, that's going to be in a head fix preparation inside a laboratory, right? And so there's a lot of really convincing VR experiments that have been done for lots of animals, including humans and flies and monkeys and mice and all of it, right? Really cool VR experiments. It turns out that vision and audition are really good for building a convincing VR. Mechanosensation is possible, but making it credible is not that easy. There's a lot of novels written about it, like Ready Player One, for example. There was this convincing like haptic feedback system, but we don't really have that right now. That's not current technology. And all of my friends who have tried to do a olfactory VR have largely found that to be the most challenging sensory modality of all. And so we're looking at a system where really we need some computational theory to really bridge that gap between behavior and neural computation. So that's where we come in for this project. Conceptually speaking, there's an animal and then there's the world. The animal acts, right, moves itself in the world in order to gather more information and to change its state in the space. And in return, it measures things from the environment. So we're going to model the animal on the left-hand side as a set of neural networks. And so in the slide, I'm going to tell you about the particular architecture and the set of modeling decisions that we have made. And so I'm going to describe what we did and try to motivate some of the simplifications that we made. And you can ask questions at the end if you'd like to. Okay. So the simulation for the world in this case is pretty simple. It is a two-dimensional arena that is scaled to be approximately, like a few meters long. So not kilometers, a few meters. What you'll see here is you'll see a lot of diagrams like this where there's a cross on which is the origin, right? This is the right answer. The agent is supposed to get here. There's going to be an arrow that is inside a circle, and that indicates the current wind direction. And so at the origin, where there's going to be Poisson events where odor packets are released, and odor packets are then going to be advected in the direction of the current wind. And as it's advected, it's also going to diffuse in size, and it's going to increase larger and larger into larger circles. In addition, there's going to be a small amount of jitter that we're going to add in the crosswind direction. So it's not completely deterministic. So there's advection, there's diffusion, and then there's a little bit of random jiggle in the crosswind direction. That's the plume. Okay. Now, what we're going to say is that the agent has access to the following information that's entirely local to where it is. It has no global map. It has no global information. It can only measure locally the local wind direction. So that's two numbers, an x, y, so it's a vector, and the local odor concentration. So that's another number, three numbers, the wind direction, x and y, and the odor concentration. In addition, there is a reward signal that we're going to give it. Mostly the reward only comes at the end once it has succeeded in localizing the odor, once it's actually reached the origin. Everywhere else, it's practically zero. There's like little detail there. We did a little bit of like curriculum learning, but I can talk about that later if you want to. In return, the agent has two different outputs. It is able to move forward, so it has a speed, and it's able to turn. Okay, so it has an angle. That's it, two outputs. So it's very simple. It can move and it can turn. And of course, because it is it's fly in the wind, its position is also changed by the wind. And so it's going to be blown by the wind as it's able to do this. So its actual course is going to be the vector sum of its own vector movement plus the wind, okay? In here, what we have is a recurrent neural network. The version that we ended up with, we tried a bunch of things. The version we ended up with is a 64-unit vanilla RNN that's fully connected, and the weights we're going to train. It receives sensory inputs of the three numbers that we talked about earlier, wind direction, x and y, and the odor concentration. So that gets fed into the recurrent RNN. The output of the RNN then is, we're going to use the output as the latent state representation, and we're going to train the agent using deep reinforcement learning using actor-critic model. So there's an actor arm, which is a feed-forward multi-layer perceptron. There's a critic arm, which is also a multi-layer perceptron. The actor outputs the actions, moving and turning, and the critic outputs the value. This whole thing is trained using deep reinforcement learning. And then after it's trained, of course, we take out the critic arm. And so the agent then runs forward in time with new simulations with just the actor arm. So the sensory inputs to the actions. Okay, that was really quick. So I'm going to pause here in case anyone has questions about the architecture, the setup, what we've actually done here in terms of how the agents are being trained.
Yes, Gary has a question.
Yeah, great work. Now, why do you call it deep reinforcement learning? Because as I say, you have a recurrent neural network and a few layers, right? It's not like you have a hierarchical stack of different layers, say, as you would have in visual cortex, right?
It is correct. The terminology here we're taking from the deep reinforcement learning literature, where I think all they're referring to is that there is a neural network that is being trained. In this case, it's a recurrent neural network. And so it's not deep in the sense that there's many layers, but it actually technically probably has infinite number of layers because it's a recurrent neural network. Does that clarify it for you?
What about the actor critic? How big are those MLPs? How big are those
Great
MLPs?
question. Yeah, the two, they're both two, the actor and the critic MLPs are identical in size. They're both 2 layers, okay? And they're 2 layer, I believe each layer is 64 units.
Okay.
And if I'm slightly wrong, I'm sorry, it's in the paper.
Okay, so the wind direction that the fly measures is in the body coordinates of the fly? Like
Great question. Perfect question. Yes, and I'm going to ask you to put a pin in that because that's actually one of the future directions that we're kind of in the middle of thinking more about. How the fly computes local wind direction is actually non-trivial. Here, we're assuming that they know it. We are pretty convinced the flies can measure it. We are like, it's unknown at the moment exactly how they do it, but our friend Flores has some ideas. But yes, we're assuming that it has an estimate of the local wind direction, but we're not asking the network to compute it.
And are you specifying the value function, or is the value function learned by the critic? Somehow?
That's correct. The value function is learned by the critic.
And so what are the hyperparameters of this reward learning? In other words, what is the reward here? Is it only 0 until you reach the goal, or is it increased?
Right. So there's a bit of a detail here, which stopped. I mean, he was like smashing his head against the wall for a year trying to get this part to work, right? So I'm glossing over a lot of pain of trying to get this to work. What I'm going to tell you the version that ended up working, okay, without telling you all the things that he tried in the middle that didn't work. The version that ended up working is the following. The reward at the origin, when they get the right answer, is something like 1,000 in arbitrary coordinates. Okay. It gets a tiny bit of reward for getting closer to the origin. And we found that that was really, really crucial in the training to get them to not just go completely off in the wrong direction in the beginning, because the initial conditions are pretty difficult. Those of you who maybe tried training these kinds of DeepRL with RNNs maybe know how computationally expensive this type of training is, and how many different efforts it really took to get this agent to converge. This was very, very non-trivial. Partially why we also ended up with a relatively simplistic plume simulation. Like physically speaking, this is not at all like what a plume actually does, right? But we just don't have the computational resources to run it for that much. So again, I'll say it again, the reward is like 1,000 once it gets to the right answer at the origin. And as it gets closer to the origin, it gets a tiny, tiny reward of like 1 or 2 as it gets closer, and like a -1 or a -2 as it gets farther and farther away. If it's like wandering off in totally the wrong direction, we gave it a small negative reward. Once it gets heading the right direction, we gave it a tiny positive reward, and then it got a very, very huge reward once it got to the right answer. That's the version that ended up working.
Any other question? Okay, I guess go on.
Okay,
Thank you.
great. So that's the system, and I'm going to show you what it does at the very end. This is a movie, and hopefully it plays okay over Zoom. It's going to loop. So what you're seeing on the left-hand side is that the agents, without anything else besides what I just described on the previous slide, learns this cast and surge behavior. Okay, so this is a pretty challenging situation. The plume is changing direction multiple times during the course of this particular simulation. You can see that it loses the plume quite often. So all of the blue dots are when it doesn't know where the odor is. The green dots are when it sniffed something. And you can see that it's trying to follow the plume. Here it loses it, it's going to go off, and it's going to just basically just go left and right. It's going to circle a little bit, and it's going to loop around until it finds the odor again. And then there it's going to surge upwind, and it's close enough there that it's actually getting into the odor. Okay. Now, interestingly, in addition to recapitulating this behavioral cast and surge motif that we already know was the correct answer based on decades of work and lots of animals, we now also have access to the precise neurodynamics because we trained the RNN. So on the right-hand side in this animation, we're showing just the first 3 principal components of the RNN. Remember, this is a 64-unit vanilla RNN. And so I'm taking the neurodynamics of this 64-dimensional space, just computing a simple PCA just for visualization purposes. And so here we're seeing what the computation, so to speak, inside the agent is doing as it's performing the behavior that's on the left-hand side. So for the remainder of the talk, we're just going to dive deep into both of these components of it, because this level of access to behavior and or dynamics is something that is just, we made up all of this stuff, right? Like it's completely by construction. This is a normative model, but we have recapitulated the behavior and we have the privilege of actually looking under the hood and seeing what the neurodynamics are. Okay. So we identified 3 behavioral modules, which start called tracking, recovery, and loss. I'll just show you what they are. So here is a pretty simple case. The plume is not changing directions. It's going just in one direction, straight to the right. And so you can see here the fly, the virtual fly, loops around a few times, gets lost, tries to go back into the plume, and then once it can, surges forward and gets to the origin. So this is kind of an ideal case, okay? It's kind of like best case scenario, relatively simple task. It loses the plume a few times, but then comes back and then gets the right answer. Here's an animation of course, it doesn't always do that. So here, the fly, virtual fly, I don't know what it's doing. It's just like totally spiraling out of control. It never comes back. And at some point, we just end the simulation because it becomes obvious that it's never coming back. Okay. So this is not a deterministic process. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't.
But the only noise is coming from the plume, right? The only noise is in the plume?
That is correct. The only noise is in the plume. Yeah. The plume is quite stochastic. We can look underneath and look at the neurodynamics of the RNN for when it gets lost like this and try to figure out what happened. And I'll unpack that in a little bit. So this policy here that we learned with DeepRL is not the first algorithm that's been able to solve this plume tracking problem. So I don't know if any of you in the audience have heard of the infotaxis algorithm. It's been around for over 10 years. But I just wanted to say a little bit about it because there's some explicit similarities and differences between what we learned and what the infotaxis algorithm also has learned. So the infotaxis algorithm, it's named infotaxis in parallel to the chemotaxis algorithm. If you know the chemotaxis algorithm is super easy. You just compute the spatial gradient and go up, or eventually find the right answer. So if you're following gradient, chemotaxis sounds great. When there's no gradient because your information is intermittent, then you can't follow the gradient because there isn't one. Now, the infotaxis algorithm that was popularized by Rajit and all, and there's been lots of follow-up since, also solves basically the same problem. So both of these algorithms are posed as solving a POMDB problem, partially as a Markov decision process. So fundamentally, we're solving a similar problem as they have solved. The differences are the infotaxis algorithm assumes the agent has a representation of the global arena. So it needs to be able to remember something about where it's been and where it is in the global sense, whereas our agent is entirely local. It only has local information and it only ever knows where it is and what has happened in its personal past. It doesn't have any knowledge of the global history or the global arena. The second key difference between infotaxis and our policy is the infotaxis algorithm requires that there's a very particular Bayesian update every single time it acquires a new piece of information. Now, in the time sense, so this was published in 2007, in the time sense, there's been lots and lots of papers attempting to update this Bayesian update to make it more biologically feasible, to make it so that it's possible for it to be implementable by real neurons. We just kind of went around that entire problem. The whole thing is implemented in the vanilla RNN. And so there's no reason that a realistic network of neurons can't do what we do. So infotaxis, that problem can be shored up. The original problem was phrased in such a way was not clear how a neuron would do it. And in our case, we're doing the update in we're not computing anything. We're just doing it in the RNN. The third key difference, as you'll probably see here in the diagram, is that their algorithm does implement a cast and search behavior. But because our algorithm was trained, we sampled an empirical distribution from fruit flies measured from Flores's lab of how fast flies actually fly forward and turn, right? So they had, our agent had bounds of how quickly they can possibly turn and how fast they can fly forward. And so we end up with these trajectories that are kind of loopy and smooth as opposed to kind of jerky in the way that the infotaxis does. Again, this is not a key constraint. Like, I'm sure they can update their algorithm so that it's a little more loopy or a little smoother. That's not a problem, but that is a difference between what we're doing and what they're doing. So if anyone has heard of the infotaxis algorithm or knows way too much about it, knows more about it than I do, this is just a short summary of what's different between what we did and what they did. Okay.
Right, there's a question here.
Yeah, so what happens if the agents can communicate? So if there are many flies, well, for example, if there are these behavioral insects like locusts or honeybees, and they can communicate with each other, then they get a gradient which is not local, right? They can get local gradient as well.
You can propose that they can, yes. I do not know of a specific example of emergent collective behavior among a large number of insects where they're communicating the gradient per se. So people who study honeybees, for example, there's a honeybee waggle. So that was a Nobel Prize many years ago. They communicate something about like the vector distance to some location where food is or whatever it is, right? A lot of the schooling work for fish, for birds, for locusts, the information is still local. So one agent will then detect its orientation and heading to its closest neighbors. Sometimes fish will communicate with each other by like local mechanosensation, right? But there's no explicit representation from a global perspective. Like a swarm is still a swarm of agents that are all local. Like in theory, you can get global information, but I am not aware of anyone having demonstrated that they do. Does that make sense?
Sure.
And please, if anyone has heard of it, correct me. I haven't heard of it. So like even a collection of agents of whatever this kind that we're building, it would still have to operate as an agent with local information.
It's okay.
Okay. All right, so we make a testable hypothesis out of this model, which is that the agents, I talked to you about this cast and surge behavior, describing as casting and the surging upwind. We discovered that rather than surging upwind, the agents are actually tracking the plume center line, like basically the thickness of the plume is what they're tracking rather than the direction of the wind. And we can see this especially when the center line of the plume is different than the current wind direction. So when the wind direction is the same, these two are completely identical. But when the plume is going like at an angle and the wind is currently heading in a different direction, it previously headed this way, and now it's heading in a different direction, there's a discrepancy between this current wind direction and the center line of the plume. It's very clear to us that whatever our agents are doing is following the center line of the plume rather than going upwind per se. So this is something that's sort of been a small argument in the literature among the experimentalists for a while. And so our prediction is that if you test animals in this scenario where the wind direction is changing commonly, then they will follow the plume rather than follow the wind. I've talked to a few collaborators since who are not our collaborators who have done more experiments that are unpublished. And this is actually, there's emerging experimental evidence that that's exactly what animals do as well. So we're waiting around for some more experiments testing this explicit hypothesis. So I'm going to show you this video that kind of demonstrates what I mean. You see here the wind change directions, right? And so the thickness of the plume is going left and the wind is going to the upper right. And the agent was clearly following the thickness of the plume rather than the direction of the wind because they're different. So here you can see it's going left, even though the wind is going up and to the right. Okay. Now, the cool thing is that as we do all of this, we also have full access to its neural dynamics. And what we can say here by just looking at the pile of things that people have hypothesized are actually represented in the insect brain in various ways, we also see that our RNN has representations of many of them. Big caveat, correlation only, okay? So here we're seeing is that there's representation of head direction. This is very well studied in the Drosophila central complex, lots and lots of papers on this. It's pretty clear that in the Drosophila brain and likely all insect brains, there is a part of the brain that represents heading direction. And so it's a complex.
Heading direction relative to what?
In allocentric coordinates. So where it is facing in the arena or in the world. Which requires integration between the self movement and it's also calibrated by landmarks.
Okay.
Yeah, pretty cool. This system also exists in mammals, including bats, but it works differently. Like in the insect, there's actually a ring, which is super cool. As far as I know, there's been no ring that's been found in mammalian systems, and birds have it too, right? Like you can like there's other animals have found different solutions to this, but there's in order to navigate effectively, makes sense that there has to be some representation of where you're actually headed in the world.
Before you go on, there's a question from the chat. What happens if there's only wind and no plume? Does it then follow the wind?
That is an excellent question. Now, if there is a wind and no plume, in our simulation, it's equivalent to the scenario where they're just lost, right? Like, and this happens all the time where just locally speaking for a period of time, they're flying around kind of in the clean air part of the arena where there's no odor plumes. There they go into the casting strategy, right? So if there's wind but no odor, they're casting about. They're going back and forth, making these large loopy trajectories in hopes that they would encounter the odor again.
Oh, thanks.
Or orthogonal, right?
Is the casting orthogonal to? Yeah.
Yes.
The casting, you mean?
Yes. Yes.
Yes, roughly speaking, orthogonal to the wind, but not precisely because we've sort of constrained it so it can't really go back and forth, right? It can only kind of make these loops.
Yes.
So
Okay.
because, is that because you artificially constrained it to a very limited yaw rate? I know the yaw rate is very limited.
Effectively, yes. So there's a lot of physical parameters in our simulation that we hand constrained to be roughly what something the size of a Drosophila would experience in roughly the size of an arena that's a few meters long. And so there's a lot of physical parameters that we set to be that. So it's a 2-meter box with a Drosophila size insect in it, right?
Okay.
And so we basically back computed how fast this thing can possibly go forward. The wind speed is calibrated to that size box and realistic wind speeds. And we also calibrated the kind of the max and min speed of the agent based on how Drosophila are observed to fly in the arena of that size. And this is mostly just, we could have done lots of different things, right? And that's, again, like interesting future direction. I'm really interested in a lot of different physical scaling observations, but for our first go, we just went with that.
Thank you.
Okay, so we also see that there is representation of odor concentration. That is a exponentially weighted moving average. So the agent has access to instantaneous odor concentration, but it seems to have obviously a memory of the average odor concentration that it's seen recently. This is also useful, right? Because it kind of, instantaneously tells you nothing. But if generally speaking, I've encountered the plume a few times, that tells me I'm more likely to be in the plume rather than outside the plume. Just a pile of other things that we saw. We also see, interestingly, there's a representation of steps since last plume encounter. Like, when was the last time I smelled anything at all, right? So it seems to be keeping count of that. And it also seems to be keeping count of odor encounters as an estimated moving average as well. A lot of these, I'm glossing over the details here, but these particular variables that we're looking for are all well grounded in the biology. And so there are experimental results showing that the Drosophila does count duration since the last encounter. Like, how long has it been since it last smelled something? And this has been done in experiments as well. Okay, so memory is crucial here. Here, what we've done is we've swapped out the RNN part of the agent with larger and larger multi-layer perceptrons, but are strictly feed forward. And so here we're basically saying, and this is in response to as you may expect, in response to a comment, basically demonstrating that memory is in fact crucial. We see a correlation between the amount of memory, how many steps, how many DTs in the past are available to the agent in the MLP configuration, and how well it's able to do, what fraction of time it successfully finds the right answer. And in all cases, the RNN does quite a bit better than all of the feed-forward cases because it actually has the ability to learn a memory of its own past.
So that's an MLP that's fed with a window of the past 12 samples, or I don't know what the sample is. Yeah, okay.
That's correct. So the measurements are 3-dimensional. So it's just 3 times 12.
Okay.
Yeah. Just as a way of artificially giving it memory without having implementing recurrence. These networks are significantly easier to train, but they don't do nearly as well. Because we have a vanilla neural network, vanilla RNN, we can also look at the eigenvalues of the recurrence matrix. Now, remember, this is only the recurrence matrix of the RNN piece. This neuroactivation actually has to be fed into the actor arm before it actually does anything. So we can see here is one example where before training and after training, we're looking at the eigendecomposition of the recurrence matrix of the RNN. We're looking at the complex plane, where we're looking at the unit circle in the imaginary plane as the dotted circle. Okay, so before training, the eigenvalues are random. This is just a random initialization. We try to keep it generally inside the unit circle just so it doesn't blow up too quickly. After training, I'm showing you here one example of one agent, and the observations I'm about to tell you about generally hold for a couple of the other agents that we have observed, but not every single one. What we see here is, interestingly, there is almost always one eigenvalue that's strictly real and quite a bit outside the unit circle. So it is pretty unstable. There are usually at least one pair, another additional pair of eigenvalues that are outside the unit circle, but very close to the real axis on the right-hand side. We then also see usually 1 or 2 pairs of complex valued eigenvalues, but on the left-hand side, also outside the unit circle. All of the ones in the middle, especially the ones that are pretty close to the origin, we sort of disregard. I'm assuming that they basically go to 0 very quickly. And so I'm paying attention, especially to the ones that are on or outside the unit circle, because they seem to be the ones that are driving the neural activity. Of course, this is, this is just an analysis of the static recurrence matrix. Remember, this thing also is actively driven by sensory inputs. So we are also computing here the eigenvalues of the recurrence Jacobian, following a derivation from this paper down here, if you want to know the details of what they did here. Essentially, what we are looking at here is a indication of the stimulus integration timescale, right? So this is a stimulus-driven RNN. We can basically compute the integration timescales. Before training, you can see that there's long timescales, short timescales, lots and lots of things. After training, it really consolidates, and a bunch of the agents converge to the solution where they're remembering on the order of 10 time steps in the past. So not 1 and not 100. And this kind of jives with the intuition that that's approximately the length of memory that is relevant for the system. That's about how long you would have to remember if you wanted to do this task successfully.
What's this mode index? What is this mode index axis? The mode index axis.
Oh, we've ordered all the eigenvalues, and so it's just the number of eigenvalues after they've been sorted. That's all.
Okay, so you're saying that there are a few eigenvalues with long time constant, basically long memory time constant.
Yep.
Somehow, because they are,
but not that long.
Not that long, yeah, like say 10 times, but I don't understand. So if you look at this eigenvalue recurrence matrix on the left, after training, you have these poles that are on the imaginary axis that are basically sinusoidal. They're not damped, they're just sinusoidal oscillators, right?
Yep. Yep.
They're basically, they happen to be mostly slightly to the left of the thing, so they're slightly damped. So when you initialize the recurrent neural network, do you initialize it with this randomly chosen spectrum of eigenvalues?
We initialize it. So before training, they're initialized as the orange dots here and the orange line here.
So you randomly sample these points in eigenvalue space.
Uh-huh.
Then from those, you derive the weights that are necessary to get that, right? Somehow.
We initialize the recurrence matrix weights according to these eigenvalues. Then we train it using DeepRL.
Okay.
And they end up at these the blue dots.
Okay, but is that essential that you initialize it inside the unit circle to keep it stable?
Yes, we tried otherwise, and it was much, much harder to train. Again, that's a kind of an empirical observation. We tried a bunch of things. This is just what the version that worked. When we tried other initializations, the agents were much more prone to just go off and do crazy things and never learn anything at all. This is the version that made it so that they seem to be more well-behaved with respect to training.
And what about that one? These are really nice observations, by the way. What about this one eigenvalue that's positive, bigger than 1, I mean?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the one that is driving the behavior so that it's going forward. It makes it so that it's always changing, right? But it's not unstable. I mean, it is unstable, but it's because the system is not autonomous. It's actually being driven by the sensory inputs, local sensory inputs at all times. I don't think that eigenvalue takes over. I don't think any of these eigenvalues actually take over, right? So I don't think that makes it do anything. I think that's the one that's actually driving it. That's kind of my hand-wavy intuitive explanation of what that was.
But on this vanilla RNN, the outputs are sent to a chance sigmoid, or
they're sent to an MLP, which is 2 more layers of nonlinearities.
But where is there's no nonlinearity on the RNN output directly?
They're not. They're not directly. Yeah. So we take the activity of the RNN, all 64 units, and feed that directly to the actor arm.
It's hard to see why it wouldn't blow up because it's totally linear system then, right?
Yes.
Totally, it must have otherwise you have to flip it so it goes.
So the RNN is also not a linear system, which is why all of these analyses, which are kind of standard in the literature, are all slightly deceiving, is because the RNN is not linear.
Oh, so it does have nonlinearity. Okay, so 10.
Oh yeah,
10
like it's an RNN. It's not a linear algebra. So it's the recurrence matrix. Like every single time step, there's a tangent nonlinearity on top of it.
Good. Okay, thanks.
Another
That's why it
question.
doesn't blow up.
Yeah, and I think this is, so your yellow initialized matrix, right? If you were to just hold it constant and then only train the remaining layers, I mean,
Good question.
I mean, that's a
Good question.
liquid machine or a
Yeah.
reservoir, right? So would it have
Good
worked?
question. No.
Have you tried? Oh.
Yes.
No, but I mean, the fact that this structure emerges with this characteristics is intriguing at least. Maybe it would work, in
Yeah.
reservoir, but it makes more sense that it should have some specific behavior. It's
Well,
not
yeah.
random behavior, right?
There's two types of training here, right? One is learning internal dynamics,
Yeah,
and then there's also doing the mapping,
the
right?
readout.
And if you separate the two, you may find that, I mean, you can't really tell if you train it.
Well,
both
what I suspect would have worked is if instead of using a medium-sized MLP as the actor arm, if we had constrained it to be a linear map, it probably also would have worked. That's my suspicion. I don't think we actually tried what I just said, but I think that may have worked. What I'm pretty confident of is that like the liquid state machine version of this does not work.
That's true.
The LSM doesn't work. Yeah, okay. Anyway,
So what happens when there are multiple odors, like there are aversive odors and attractive odors? So
Great question.
So do you like, would this property that you're mentioning will still hold, or you will the Eigen
I have no
spectrum?
idea. We haven't tried it. That sounds like a great project. Like someone should try this.
by the way, Ben, is all the code for this open on GitHub? Is the whole
There is.
project?
Yep,
The whole
all there.
project- Yeah.
Yep,
Yeah,
project is there.
By the way, feel free to post all this stuff on the Slack, the paper link, the code link and things like that for later.
Yeah, it's
Thank
all
you.
easy to find. It's all on the internet. Yep, everything's there.
Another question on the chat?
Yep, there's
And
another question.
I've had a rotation student reproduce it already, so I'm reasonably sure it actually still does run.
Okay.
There's another question on the chat, just about, does the nonlinearity in the neural network limit the oscillations for eigenvalues above 1 to make it a little stable? So I guess that's.
So it'll be limits.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, this is why, like, like you're trying to, if you look in the literature about people who are trying to analyze RNNs, this is kind of like it's pretty standard, right? This is the zeroth order thing that you would do. But yes, it's not a linear system. So yeah.
Awesome, thank you.
So how would you verify that this phenomena occurs in an actual insect brain? Like you would try with a novel odor and train them, and then see if their neural activity also show an Eigen spectra that looks like this before training and after training. Like I'm curious, like how do we
Measure the
verify?
Eigen spectra though. How do you measure this Eigen spectra?
Yes, we measure from projection neurons all the time in the insect brain, and you can do the same analysis.
I see.
With this. So you can see if they have learned the response, like they're responding to the odor or not. So there are these very few neurons that actually project too, which are, and then they instruct the many different dynamics.
Great, but I'll make a distinction here between looking at the eigenvalues of the neural activity versus looking at the eigenvalues of, this is effectively the connectivity matrix,
Yeah, different.
which we cannot directly measure in the brain.
But you can't infer one, I don't know, maybe that's, if you measure from many neurons at the same time, would you be able to do the same PCA trajectory and would be able to determine?
Many people have tried, and it doesn't. It's not impossible, but it's actually quite challenging to do that.
Anyway, Shannon, we as engineers, we want to build things that work. What does it matter exactly what? Well, of course. Speak for yourself.
So the usually, I'm totally going back and forth on this. I completely agree with you, Toby. Like, it's not crucial. Like, I'm not interested. Like, there's a part of me that really wants to understand how biology works, because that is what biology does. However, if I want to use collaborators who work on Drosophila, I'm not interested in Drosophila per se, right? I'm interested in strategies, algorithms, and principles. And so I'm interested in plume tracking because it's something that not only fruit flies do, but basically all animals do. And even non-animals, like microbes do this. right? So from an algorithmic perspective, this is super interesting to me, not because this one particular brain does do it, but I'm interested in how all brains might do it. And especially what are the differences? If you are a housefly that is quite a bit larger than a Drosophila, how does that change? Right? Like, does it do it totally differently or not? What if you are a hammerhead shark in the ocean following, I don't know, like some fish got killed a few kilometers away, you're trying to smell that, right? Like, how does that work? And the ability of animals to accomplish this particular task does currently exceed engineered systems for tracking odor plumes. And so from a pure engineering perspective, this task as an optimization problem is currently better solved by biological systems than in engineered systems. So we still have something we may learn from biology, but I'm not interested in exactly how this one animal does it.
Okay, so about 5 minutes, 5 minutes.
There's still one more question.
Is it possible to measure the paths? Are they similar to the actual Drosophila, the actual fly? It's like how much different the synthetic system follows the real life behavior? Simulated versus behavior, real behavior of the Drosophila.
Yeah, so Flores is probably the person who's measured more of these real trajectories than anyone else. He can only really do it in a wind tunnel that is, again, order 1 meter with a cross section of probably 0.5 meter. And you basically use a really fancy camera system. There's like 12, 24 cameras or so. And if you are him and you know how to calibrate them all, you can measure them. And so the discrepancy here, which is a great question for me to move to the next slide, is thinking about what we want to do next. So what we have done here, this diagram is what we currently have. So it's a little simplified diagram of what we currently have, right? So this is the arbitrary black box RNN. There's a 2-layer actor model, 2-layer critic model, and there's this 2-dimensional wind environment. So what we like to do in an iterative way is to then map this onto more of the known neural circuits and physiology, build up to a 3D environment so that we can then directly compare the kinematic trajectories of the fruit flies. And then we can also, in a modular way, build in vision modules, olfactory modules, mechanosensory modules, and then use a neural network that is not just a plain vanilla neural network that is just like, it might as well be a liquid state machine, but to actually have the neural network, with the network of neurons rather, be constrained by the known connectome of the Drosophila, which is now emerging. And so this is like a big iterative process, right? And the whole thing is, I don't know, we're going to like head in this direction. Some combination of us will build pieces of this and then put it together. This is my last slide, by the way. And so I'm done and we can talk for as little or as much as you want.
I have a question. Do you hear me on this side?
Yes. Yep.
Okay, cool. Yeah, this might relate to this slide as well. So I'm looking at the plume simulations and they appear to me less intermittent than what I would expect, especially far away from the source where the insect is still relying a lot on the visual, on the odor signal and not on the visual cues. So I was wondering if you played around with the increasing the intermittency of the signal, and maybe connected to this, if you had real plumes, would you expect something to change in the strategies or in the dynamics of the neurons?
Great question. First, the answer to the first one is yes, we've done it. We can, so the odor packets are born as Poisson processes. So we can just crank down the Poisson rate so that to make the plumes sparser and sparser. I didn't make a big deal out of it here, but in our paper, there are example trajectories of the agents following the plume as they get more and more intermittent. And we also show the time history of when they encountered the plume. And you can kind of see that it's like, blip, nothing for a long time, blip, nothing for a long time, et cetera, et cetera. The key here seems to be that we were unable to train the agents in the sparse situation. So we had to train them when the plumes were less intermittent, but after they were trained, they were still able to perform quite well when we put them in a more intermittent situation. But that's probably a detail of the RL training. So that's my suspicion. Not like they categorically can't do it. It's just like we were not able to manage to do it for the reviewers. The second question is also really interesting. So very little of this type of naturalistic odor statistic data exists that have been measured in physical reality on this scale. Flores has some. And so one of our recent conversations, we started actually talking about, because he has this data and we can make better simulations based on the real data. This simulation's been around and it's been used in this context for a while just because it's super duper simple. It's super fast to run, which is really great when you're doing RL because you just need to run it really a lot of different times, right? Updating the plume simulation to be more realistic is on the list of things to do. I will attempt it once we have larger computers.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question. Jerry, you have a question?
Yep, there's another question from the chat. Do you have an estimate of the fraction of neurons in the fruit fly that are dedicated to odor sensing?
Oh gosh, I am very confident that my odor sensing colleagues in Drosophila know the answer to this one. I do not know the answer. I do know that it's important for them because it's an important sensory modality for them. And they have chemosensors all over their bodies. They can smell with the tips of their fingers. I also can say pretty concretely that multisensory integration is something that is pretty important for all animals, including Drosophila. And so it's not like there's a pure olfactory labeled line, so to speak, where that information is just olfactory. I think there's lots and lots of places in the animal's brain where olfactory information is tied together with other sensory information to compute things that are behaviorally relevant for the animal instead of representing odor per se.
Awesome, thanks.
Okay, so no, I think what we'll do now, because everybody has work.
Okay. Yeah, that's right. You're in a Lance class.
Yeah, I was in a Lance class and he was really pitching the course and
No, I was an undergrad in the class. Come on.
No, I know you're an undergrad, but I think there was the undergrad Tech are really pretty amazing. And then he went on to Cornell. We recruited one of the students.
So he was also grad student though.
Yeah, he was, he finished his PhD at Japan, but he went on to Cornell, and then him and a couple of other students and some characters to be unnamed started a company, and then we recruited one of his students to at Hopkins. And then we're excited we're going to have someone to do a synchron PLSI at Hopkins. We bought computers, room, labs, and then all has to be paid. School starts September. August 27. So Salina says, Andreas, I started a company, I'm not going to show up. Anyway.
It's not he was that very good.
Yeah. So he went on to do a lot of good things with this company and then they divorced. He divorced with the company. And since left Cornell and his idea, and since idea, we had a chance to interact and do another time. Hopefully, we get some grant to formally work together.
Nobody trusts us, Andreas.
Nobody trusts us. No. Anyway, it's great to have Rajit here.
Thanks, Andreas, for introduction. So what I'm going to talk today is about a project we are starting up. I guess we've been working on this on and off for a few years now. We are getting going on this pretty seriously this year. And I call this talk toward programmable CMOS Ising machine because I think we're heading there, and I think we know what we're doing, but we shall see. But what I'm going to talk about today is joint work with my collaborator, Professor Rajit Roy-Chaudhary from UC Berkeley. And of course, it should go without saying that any number of things I'm showing were all done by my students. So Thomas, he's been working on it. So some of the stuff I might be able to skip over. Please tell me if I should skip things. I'm just going to give you a key, sort of a quick overview of what I mean when I say Ising machines. By the way, just a caveat, if you look at the literature, it's a little confusing. Some of the papers have signs flipped. Max is turned into mins, it's all the same. So please bear that in mind. So just be a little, whenever you pick up a paper, it's sort of good to know like exactly which polarity it is so that you're not confused there. So the Ising problem formulation is usually written depending on which paper you're looking at. The problem statement is simply that you're given a function. It's called the Hamiltonian because all of this stuff borrows from Ising spin glasses in physics, right? You've got spin variables S1 through Sn, and why is that a -half when I'm doing a minimization, right? These things bother me as a computer scientist, but but it doesn't really make any difference. So you're minimizing -half the summation of weights Jij and Si and Sj, and sometimes you'll see this additional term with a minus summation of Hi Si. Each spin variable is the Si is supposed to be spins. They're supposed to be the +1 or -1. And you can actually get rid of the term in gray if you want by just imagining that you've got one more spin variable that happens to be fixed at +1. Right? Then you're done, right? Then it's just, I can ignore the gray. The weight matrix is symmetric. Okay,
So the gray is the bias.
yeah, you can think of it as a bias, exactly. And there are various ways you can think about it. Some people will, anyway, there are different ways you can do it, but yeah. But the easy way is just pretend S0 as a spin variable that's +1. And then I'm done. Another alternate formulation of this is sometimes called QBO, which is quadratic binary optimization. It's the same kind of formula, except the variables are 0 or 1, and it's actually the same problem. And you just convert with this method. All that happens is that half will turn into some constant thing that's, again, you're minimizing, so who cares about constants? Right? If you want to sort of get some intuition as to when this problem is easy versus hard, supposing all the Jij's were positive, right? Then you want this number to be as negative as possible, so it's an easy solution, right? You want the Si's and Sj's to all be equal to each other. You're going to solve the problem, right? So there's a trivial solution when everything has the same sign, and the sign is positive. If I'm trying to solve a minimization problem. I apologize in advance if I did positive and negative and minimization and maximization. Okay, so does that make sense? So it's easy to solve that case. So the interesting cases are, of course, when the Jij is a mixture of positive, negative, or even all negative, because then you want all the spins to disagree, right? And that's positive. Okay. So far, so good. Great. So why is this at a neuromorphic workshop? So I thought I would show you this connection to Hopfield networks. I hope you may have already seen this, but I thought I would just summarize it. And this is actually literally from the 1982 paper, right? You don't have to look at any recent literature for this. You have N neurons in Hopfield's original paper. You've got N neurons with each output VI, where it's just set to 0 for not firing. And these are all terminology literally from this paper. I think in his paper, instead of Jij, he uses Tij, but that's about it. All the neurons are coupled to each other, and the time evolution rule in his paper, he had like 2 versions. He called one an asynchronous evolution rule and a synchronous evolution rule. The only difference is, whether you view this update, where you look at the sign of the input weights times, the neuron, you take the sign of that. I think I flipped this. Anyway, doesn't matter. Whether the time evolution rule is applied in a synchronized way, so you have a vector of values that evolve in time, or you pick a neuron at random and flip it. We call that an asynchronous part. So you have these two variations. But the easy thing to look at is you just take a look at what happens to this quantity if you apply an update rule like this, right? So let's ignore this for a second and look at the sign of this sign of the term that happens when I ignore VI, right? Now, if that quantity were positive, I want that term in my summation if I want to minimize the negative of that. Make sense? And if the sign was the opposite, I want to kill that term to minimize the summation. And that's exactly what this is. Sorry, this is wrong. There should be a 1 at the top and a 0 at the bottom. But if you apply that update rule, that's exactly what it does. Right? And I hope this looks familiar from the previous page. Right? So you're basically doing the same thing. So a standard Hopfield network evolution is actually trying to minimize this. Okay. There are other ways you can look at this. If I take the gradient of this function with respect to a particular variable, I get the summation, right? So there are different ways you can look at it. So you all get it. So all of these things are all deeply connected to each other, which is why I'm sure this is a topic that the neuromorphic workshop. Make sense? Is that clear? Yeah. It's very simple. So my collaborator, Professor Rajit at Berkeley, has been looking at oscillator-based Ising machines. So I'm going to assume, I'm going to just give you a brief overview of what that means. With this nice picture that I thanked him for this picture from his paper, and he was like, I don't know what this picture is. So I was like, he was like, oh, my grad student made it. So that's people without saying as well. His grad student Tianxi, his main thesis work. So the idea here is, so remember the basic problem is you're trying to have some physical system that has these spin variables, and we want to compute something as some physical system whose time evolution minimizes that Hamilton. And I've already shown you one example of this, Hopfield networks. That's what the Hopfield network is doing, right? It's trying to minimize that. That's another way to look at what it's doing. You can do the same thing with oscillators, it turns out. So the idea is, supposing you have an oscillator that has a sort of a natural frequency of f, okay? And I apply a small perturbation at f1 to it. Now, all of the oscillator folks know that what will happen is, well, here you can see that sort of A, that the perturbation is in the line, and so the oscillator will eventually shift and it'll injection lock to that particular frequency, right? And it's very close to the natural frequency of the oscillator. Right, so that's shown sort of in this picture B, where what you're seeing is a phase, and the phase will, no matter where the phase is, eventually the phase will get to zero, right? And you'll injection lock that. This is well known. The analysis of this is actually fairly non-trivial, but it's been done in the, I think, 90s, sometime around there. I can't remember exactly when. So that's a straightforward injection lock. Now, we want two values, right? We want +1 and -1. So if you did this with a bunch of oscillators, they all go to injection lock with the same frequency, and it would be the same. That's not that interesting. But supposing instead I put a perturbation at twice the natural frequency, rather than at the natural frequency of the oscillator, okay? Then once again, turns out that the oscillators will injection lock. But now there are 2 points at which it can injection lock, right? Because my perturbation is running at twice the frequency, the oscillator can't keep up, so it just skips every other, every other cycle, if you want to think of it that way. And so you'll injection lock at either 0 or 180 degrees out of phase. Okay, and this is called subharmonic injection lock. Yes.
And that assumes that there is a second order nonlinearity in the system.
That's right. Yes.
If it's only odd nonlinearity, this doesn't work.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. That's right.
Oh, you mean the oscillators?
Yeah.
They need to be non-linear.
But second order, you have second order nonlinearity.
I believe that's right. Yeah.
If it were an odd symmetric system,
they would all go to the same place, basically. You're saying, right? Basically, the oscillator has to be able to lock in both modes.
Vice versa.
Essentially what it is.
Yeah.
I'm not an oscillator expert, by the way. So, and this is sort of a cartoon picture of what happens. And it turns out that, I'm sorry, I'm not going to go through the math of this, because if I did, then, we'd be here beyond lunchtime. But basically what ends up happening is if you couple these oscillators, right? So you add these locking signals and you couple the oscillators with a weight that corresponds to the weight metric, you can essentially show that the dynamics of this nonlinear dynamical system with subharmonic injection locking has a Lyapunov function that matches the Hamilton. Okay, and that's the basic same principle. So this is another physical system that you're supposed to let it run, and it's minimizing the same Hamiltonian, so that you're going to try to solve the Ising problem.
Because the equation is that the phase is a continuous variable, and that's really what you're really.
Right. So if these two are coupled, and let's say this is a big weight, then if they're out of phase, then there'll be a large amount of current that goes from one to the other to shift its phase, right? That's the idea. So the strength of the coupling is sort of the thing that pushes things apart. That's the basic side. So maybe there's a question. Is the perturbation the phase or the amplitude? Well, you could do it, view it, depends on your viewpoint. The perturbation well, if you inject current, then you will be perturbing the voltage, but you can also just view that as a phase perturbation. In fact, normally when you're analyzing oscillator dynamics, everything eventually gets converted into the phase space analysis. And that's kind of why I'm talking about phase more than anything else. Right? But yeah, I mean, you can view those as similar things. Obviously, if you have like some huge injection, it's not going to behave as a normal circuit anymore. But
although some of the conductances will be negative, right?
some of the conductances will be negative, but you can just view it exactly, and you can view that as a current flowing the other way, right? There are different ways you can do it, and you can build a differential circuit. I mean, there are lots and lots of variations. There are sort of endless variations on the circuits you could use for this and for coupling and so on and so forth. Okay. So I'm actually not here to talk about the endless variations. So what I'm here to talk about is, let's assume that that's what our goal is. So let's assume that we can build a physical system of this type that can solve the Ising. Okay, so that's let's assume that actually happens to work. It's already a big assumption, by the way, but let's assume that's the case. Now, what does this mean? So I'm a chip designer and I want to know what to build, right? So, well, you give me an Ising problem, I can build an ASIC for it, right? That's not that, well, okay, so maybe that's really important for some things, but that's not very nice because for every new problem, I have to build an ASIC. So what I'd like to do instead is to build one chip that can map a range of wide variety of Ising problems, right? And what I'm going to talk to you is sort of how we are going to go about doing it. That's what I'm going to spend the rest of this talk on. So this is sort of summarizing the solution principle, right? The solution principle is you need to build a graph in hardware, right? With your spins, whatever your spin primitive is, be they neurons or oscillators, there's a bunch of other things you can do as well. Those are sort of the vertices of this graph. You've got coupling between them. These could be conductances, other things, depends again on exactly what physical principle you're using for this oscillator dynamics, right? And you want the physics of the time evolution of the system to solve the problem, right? That's sort of how all of these things work. And so what I need is we need some hardware that allows me to change all of these things, right? I need to be able to, so I have spins, that's great. But then I need to be able to change weights. I need to be able to change which spin is coupled to which spin, and so on and so forth. Okay. And depending on what you're doing, some of these couplings can be sort of interesting, right? If you're doing oscillator-based coupling, it's essentially current injection, so you need bidirectional connections, right? So that's why normally they just build dedicated circuits, because then you've got a nice resistor connecting them and so on and so forth. But that doesn't solve my problem of being able to map sort of any graph. So let me sort of show you all the standard ways people do this. There's might be a lot of literature on this, especially in the quantum computing world, right? So the standard way people build sort of their programmable system is they use something called a QiNS graph. If you don't know what that is, think of a QiNS move on a chessboard, right? So that corresponds to the connectivity, right? So essentially you're connected to your 4 nearest neighbors and diagonal connections, and then you build the graph out. And then obviously there will be plenty of graphs that don't map to this. So then you do something like the following. You say, well, I want multiple copies of the same spin variable so that I can connect to enough things. So if I have a QiNS graph, for example, one spin can only connect to its 8 neighbors, right? But if I have to connect to 10 neighbors, what do I do? Well, what do I do? I make a copy of this spin, and then sort of force these spins to be equal to each other with some sort of other coupling, or you could just have very heavy weights. There are various ways people try to do this. But then you get enough of a neighborhood to then get all your neighbor connectivity and so on and so forth. And then you have to embed this in this plane and map it to this QiNS graph, right? So that's a pretty classic way to try to do this problem. Yes.
So really, this assume that you can't build a chip with the dense connectivity.
So exactly, right. So what I was going to get to that. So the reason a lot of people, by the way, the other graph, there's a Chimera graph, and the 2000 now they've got a Pegasus graph. There are people who've done all-to-all graphs, and a lot. And to get to your question, really, a lot of this is in fact, if you look carefully, what they're really physically constraining themselves with in most of the literature is the fact that they're trying to build a quantum computer with qubits. And this is what they can build, right? If I'm building this in CMOS, why should I constrain myself with these things? Okay, so there's absolutely no reason to, right?
And the green connections here are definitely not quantum then.
Oh, yeah, well, I'm going to keep my mouth shut.
So why, I think, can you explain that? I mean, don't you want to minimize your other bisection battery at some point between the components?
You do want to minimize the wire. Let's put it that way.
Yes, the wire, yes.
Of course you do, because the wiring otherwise going to take over your whole chip. It's going to take over your whole chip anyway, but you don't want it to take over it to a ridiculous extent, just a normal extent. But yes, you do want to reduce the wire. Okay? But my point is, if you look at the literature, they talk about how wonderful these graphs are. But the reason they're wonderful isn't because they're good graphs for the Ising problem. It's wonderful because they know how to build those graphs with quantum computing, with qubits, basically.
Nice.
Okay, and the literature doesn't. It's not clear from reading the literature that that's what they're happy about. But that, I mean, it's like, I have this awesome quantum computer and I can do this, right? Yeah.
How do you get away with all the connections that need to be made? Right.
Oh, yeah, so I'm going to show you how we do, how we plan to solve this problem. It turns out when I show you how to do it, you'll be like, oh yeah, of course. It's not that hard, actually.
Address event. Address event, right?
You can do it with address event. So, but I want to support also this sort of straight analog current coupling for oscillators and other mechanisms, right? So I'm just going to show you a general scheme that works for all of these possibilities. And then, I mean, there are plenty of other schemes as well, right? Yeah, you could use, if you have neurons, you could use address events, things like that. Okay. Any other questions? So this is like the one slide, like, yeah, of course you can now leave. It turns out that this problem is solved. Okay. This is not a huge mystery. And this problem has been solved in the FPGA literature for over 40 years. Okay. So what is an FPGA? I'll show you what an FPGA is in a few books. But I have some logic design, which is some collection of gates and wires. I have a physical chip that has an implementation of some programmable gates and programmable wires, and I have to be able to map something. Okay. So you've got a source graph that's generated by writing some RTL or your favorite order description language and doing running logic synthesis. And you've got a target graph, which is the FPGA hardware, and you know, it's been a very long time since somebody wrote RTL and ran it through the FPGA flow, and it came back and said, I'm sorry, I don't have enough wire. Okay. So this has been a very, very, very hard early lesson. Okay, so people, you know how to do this today, but there have been plenty of bad designs in this space. Okay, so people have learned from very, very painful mistakes over the last 40 years. Okay, and essentially Xilinx and Altera figured this out very painfully over lots and lots of experimentation. And everybody else that tried to do their own cool solution and ended up reinventing the Xilinx and Altera architecture, which are also very similar to each other. And that's another example of a place where you need a lot of wiring, okay? But you don't want to have built a hardware which has tons of wiring because you're completely going to kill your area. So the FPGA community has actually figured out this very nice balance between programmability and sort of minimizing how much die area you have to give. Okay, so we're just going to reuse them results. So what I'm going to show you is sort of how we do this. So for those of you who don't know, this is my sort of cartoon view of an FPGA. So what an FPGA hardware looks like. So the idea is you've got an array, you've got some logic which is programmable here. I've written it as LB for logic block. You've got a connection, and then you've got this wiring grid. This is, by the way, not to scale at all. If I were drawing this to a sort of scale, this would be a point. Okay, so the logic is basically epsilon of the area. But in spite of that, we can fit hundreds of, millions of logic gates in a single FPGA. Okay, so there's logic, there's connection and routing. There's usually the terminology is connection block, switch block, and logic block. That's the standard FPGA terminology. The connection block is where you connect from the logic to the interconnect, and the switch box is where you connect from the interconnect to the interconnect to turn and things like that. Okay, this is sort of my cartoon view of an FPGA. You've got programmable lookup tables in the logic block. So the logic block has things like lookup tables, flip-flops, carry chains, adders. And then, I had these little stripes. I'm not really going to get into these stripes here. Usually you have stripes that have like SRAM blocks and DSP blocks and things like that. Now they have the DSP blocks have now been reading into the AI blocks. Yeah. Anyway, so usually. And so we want to build the equivalent thing for a programmable Ising machine, right? Because then if I have a rich routing architecture, then I've solved my mapping problem, so I get my commenting, right? But I need two other things. So I don't need my logic gates and things like that for my Ising machine. I need a spin hardware for my spin module. So my lookup tables, I'm not going to use lookup tables, I'm going to use a spin unit. Whatever that might be, it might be your neurons, it might be an oscillator, it could be something else. I don't care, I'm agnostic to that at this level of abstraction. And I need to be able to program the weights and the connectivity, okay? So in terms of like sizing up this chip, what do I care about? I care about how much routing I need to be able to map a wide range of Ising graphs. I care about how many spins I need, but that one's easy, right? I'm going to build an array architecture. I'll have a capacity that's based on the number of spins. And then I need to know how many weights I need per spin roughly. I need to know what range of weights I need to support, right? Are the weights just binary? Actually, that wouldn't be very useful. You need a wide range of weights. So I kind of care about the resolution of my weights, right?
So spins are neurons.
Yes. Correct. Yeah.
And the noise would be in the spin hardware.
The noise would be in the spin hardware, right? So the noise, the injection locking, all of that is sort of overlaid on the whole chip, right? You can think of that as my power grid, right? If you like, if I were to pick an FPGA analogy, right? It's part of my sort of core that drives the whole thing.
But you inject the noise.
Yeah, you can inject the noise. Yeah, you might want to inject noise if you want from the outside, or you might have a noise signal, and then maybe you want to modulate the amplitude of the noise or something like that, right?
And the neurons of the spins are going to be analog, mixed signal.
Yeah. Yeah, they need to be at least, so far we understand it so far.
Nice.
To get good results at the moment. As I said, I'm a digital chip designer. Usually, usually most projects I work on at the end end up being all digital.
Yes.
But that's when we've understood what can be digitized. Here, I don't think we understand that yet. So they're going to not start at this. This is not going to start as digital. It's going to start as analog.
Maybe the computing memory.
Yeah.
That will replicate.
Sure.
So you're limited here in the size of the matrix.
That's correct.
By how many bits you can represent in memory one way or another, right? It's mostly SRAM here, I guess, SRAM blocks.
Right. So in an FPGA, by the way, it turns out that most of the die area of an FPGA is actually just SRAM.
Yes.
And the SRAM used for controlling the configuration bits.
Yeah, but still there could be a few tens of mega.
Yeah, it just depends on how big your architecture is. Yeah.
And that's the largest connectivity matrix.
That's right.
You can do that.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. That's right. That's right. I mean, the only reason we are trying to do it this way is to support sort of continuous coupling, right? Which basically means you would need to read the weights continuously anyway. So you can't consolidate them into a centralized memory, and you need to tap every weight all the time. So that's kind of why we are doing this.
So it looks like the Neuromorphic. Or no. It's an FPGA.
It's an FPGA. Yeah, it's like an FPGA. Many more people know what an FPGA looks like than what Neuromorphic is.
Every time you have a wire crossing there, one of those cross bars,
Yeah.
or SB, I don't know what SB is.
Oh, it's the switch block.
Switch block, yeah, there's like 10 FETs there, right?
6 if it's a crosspoint. But okay, so I'm not getting into the details of this. So how exactly you build this, I can point you to literally thousands of papers.
Yeah, this is there like 10 FETs per switch.
A switch usually has 6 FETs. A crosspoint at 6, basically 6 pattern resistors, right? It's a pretty standard topology. But you shouldn't forget that along with those 6 pattern resistors is 6 bits of SRAM.
Yeah, or 6 bits of SRAM.
So they're independently
wire.
For controllable path transistor
Oh,
in your whole design.
yes.
And that's why the whole chip is basically SRAM.
Yes.
Okay. If I showed you like a scale die, I mean, we've taped out many FPGAs. So it was really funny to like design an FPGA and then after that read the FPGA literature. And it's like the picture of what an FPGA look like. It's like the scale is totally wrong. Okay. Anyway.
The SRAM is all in one place.
No. It's totally distributed. This is actually a fun design problem. I mean, I'm happy to talk to you about this. But if you look at most of the literature from basically the academic literature kind of doesn't correspond at all to what you really build. If you want it to be efficient. But
like the block ramps.
yeah, I don't have any block RAM in this article. But the configuration bits are also done with SRAM bits. Because so let's put it this way. If I use normal standard flip-flop register for my config bit, or even a scan chain kind of 2 latches kind of structure, right?
600.
You need more than 600 versus my SRAM bit cell.
Yes.
That's like a 3x area penalty. Okay, roughly. Even if I make the SRAM cell VR sequencing, which you have to because otherwise it won't yield. I can get into that later, but if you're interested. But and I already told you that like 70 to 80% of the die area is the optimized SRAM. So I would have then tripled that, right? So it's a huge penalty. So you can't afford, if you have a big design, you can't afford to put, a simple scan just in you're tripling your die area, basically. Yeah, nobody does it. Except papers. So we actually kind of talked through this. I'm just summarizing this. Right? So for Ising machines, what we need is we need to basically adapt this architecture to support bidirectional coupling. But that's straightforward because if I use fast transistors to connect things, then I get bidirectional coupling. What you can't do are some of the standard FPGA optimizations. So only FPGAs in the 80s and early 90s had these fast transistor type interconnects. Now they are all buffered with drivers. So all the wires are directional, and of course that means they're also digital. So you can't do that if you want like analog coupling between oscillators. So it just depends. So it depends on the flavor of your spin, what kind of architecture you could use for coupling, for the routing.
In your case, are you making coaxial? Are you making coaxial coupling? Are you making channels for the analog wire?
No, not at all, because this stuff is running very slow.
Oh, I see.
Okay, this stuff is running very, very slow. Okay, it's like megahertz oscillator. It doesn't matter. I mean, so it depends. Again, all of this is just, straightforward. It's understood engineering. Let's just put it that way. Right? Like you can decide what kind of thing you need to support, and then decide the channel you accommodate it. Okay. So this is what so this is the same picture, except now what I'm going to have as my logic block is I'm going to have some sort of spin hardware. Pick your favorite spins. I'm going to have a set of programmable coupling weights, right? And attached to each thing that's programmable, I'm going to have some configuration with. So that picks the setting. And I may want to be able to disconnect these because I have fewer weights than the number of physical things I have. And that's going to then limit, if I give you, 10 weights here, then on average, I can't have really more than 10 weights per spin. I'll go to another one. Yes.
Are you imposing an X-enable connectivity, or you really?
No. The whole point of this is to get away from the nearest neighbor connectivity and basically reuse all the FPGA literature that lets you connect to pretty much anything.
I know, but in the wires, without buffers, no doubt, how are you going to do this now happening?
Yeah.
It's not animals, it's digital.
Well, you can do that. There are many answers to this question. Right? So one answer is let's just run it slow for now, right?
Delays.
Just run it slow, run all the frequencies slow,
And everything works.
and then everything works. The other thing you could say, well, let's run it high, then maybe you've got to do some, you may have some like spike like digital communication between them, right? You might have times, I mean, there are all the usual tricks are available. Let's put it that way, right? Okay. Right. That's basically the setup. Okay. Yes.
How do you isolate all these spin elements so that there's no like parasitic interaction?
Oh no, that's I mean this logic block is a very small part of the die area. So like you do all the usual analog circuit design to isolate the spins so that they're nice, right? I mean you have to worry about mismatch. I mean you have to worry about all the usual things, right? For the oscillator work. Right.
Yes.
Yeah. But you have to remember that there is one saving grace, right? There's an injection locking system. So that's helping you out, right? But of course, the mismatch has to be within the range that will always injection lock property and subharmonic injection lock, right? Yes.
How much of the signal of the oscillator do you actually need to get this locking effect? Like, does it need to
Not much. It needs to be such low perturbation. It doesn't need to be significant. Yeah, it doesn't need to be that high. Yeah.
You designing for little mismatch there, which means you increase the area.
Yeah. So the area is bigger than you would think if I just look at the circuit, right? Yeah. But don't worry, we're going to overwhelm by the internet.
So is it a logic block or is it animal logic block?
I call it an Ising logic block to be agnostic, right? So yeah, I'm using the FPGA terminology, but really it's all.
Yeah, I can see how this works as a digital system.
Right.
But once it's analog, that would be very hard to scale, right?
No, so okay, it'll be very, very hard to scale. Okay. So yes. Excellent question, right? So this would be extremely hard to scale if once you map your Ising machine, you always end up connecting like one corner of your chip to the other with some weird, horrible analog route. Okay. But this is why we are leveraging the FPGA literature. The interconnect mapping looks nothing like that. If it did, you'd get really bad performance of your FPGAs, right? So it turns out that there is a well understood literature on how to architect the routing so that with high confidence, you won't be in this problem. You won't have this problem. And we see that actually. So we map, I'll show you something.
No matter the Q matrix?
Oh no, you can always construct a horrible Q matrix to kill this. So I will show you how we build our Q matrices so that we don't have this problem.
Also, there's a problem. The assets growth in Switzerland, I mean, this Neuromorphic architecture. Well, they have all these full interconnects, and they needed 1 day of the Swiss supercomputer time to actually clear the source application and problem on the hardware.
Correct.
So, I mean, if it takes a day or a supercomputer to solve the problem, but it's not.
That's correct. So, I completely agree. So, but that's why I'll say it again. I've said it multiple times already, but I'll just repeat it. This is what the FPGA community has figured out over 40 years. How much hardware resources to allocate for the routing and what configurable topology, so the place and route tools can run in a reasonable amount of time.
Wait a minute, so the FPGA community has figured out how to solve the QiNS problem.
Not the QiNS problem, the programmable routing graph embedding problem that for graphs, it's heuristics, right? I mean, nobody's saying
they have a heuristic solution.
They have a heuristic solution that works really well in practice for the kind of graphs that come out of logic synthesis.
Have you bothered you for that inside?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no. You're right. I mean, so you know how many people are running FPGA tools on a daily basis over the last 40 years, and these days you don't run into trouble. In the 90s, you would run place and route and come back 2 weeks later, and then you would if you had money, you would call Xilinx and say, hey, what's wrong, right? And then they would come and help you fix it. But usually what that meant was that they would add interconnect in their next architecture. So they've already gone through this learning process to get pretty good results in practice. Okay?
So
But that's not saying that it is correctly solving all the problems, because I can always come up with a problem that it's not going to solve, right? So the question is, how good is this when you're trying to map Ising problem instances? And that's what I'm going to show you in the rest of the talk.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes, there's a question. Okay. So I'm going to walk through a complete example of how we do SAT on this argument. Okay. So this is a slightly non-standard SAT mapping, so I thought I would show it to you. And it's again related to the fact that we have this FPGA architecture in mind, and that's why we use this particular mapping. Okay. So you all know what SAT is. I hope I don't need to explain it. This is one of the cornerstones of complexity theory, is Cook's theorem, which is 3 SAT is any. Right? And by the way, if you didn't know this, 2 SAT as a trivial polynomial time solution. Okay, complexity is the number of edges in the number of clauses, basically. Easy. So, what is SAT? I can just think of SAT as a Boolean formula. Some function, and I need to just find an assignment of variables that's true. So, instead of viewing it as a mathematical problem, I can just pretend I have a bunch of variables with some combinational logic whose output happens to match the Boolean formula. That's my SAT expression. Okay. And what I want to do is I actually want to run this combinational logic backward. Right? That's what I'm trying to do. I want to say, this is 1. What are the inputs? Right? And of course, this is not. Right? So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to basically use the Ising machine to run the logic backward. Right? So convert it, instead of having this as logic, I'm going to view this as constraints. So a gate is not computing the output, it's a constraint that says the output must match the gate's logic expression for the input. Right? And so I want to run it back. Okay.
So this is like ham.
If you want to think of it that way, sure. Yes. Right. So instead of saying you're the index and you're the value, I know the value, what's the index. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Okay. So remember, I want to not end up with a situation where I have a horrible Ising graph that is going to stress my place and route, basically. Right? That's what I'm trying to avoid. Okay. And we know where we can get graphs that map well, and that's through logic synthesis. You know that. Right? So that should tell you what I'm going to do next. I'm going to take this combination formula.
Yes. So that combinational logic, you don't implement every possible function of the L variables.
No. This is my SAT problem. Right? I can just write that as a Boolean formula, right? That's an honest to goodness Boolean formula. I can type it in parallel. Right? So that's how we start. So we start by taking, so the standard, there's the SATlet database, which has known hard SAT instances. So I basically wrote a script that can take any problem from the SATlet database and print out a value. It's trivial, it takes like 5 minutes to write. That prints out a module where you literally just write down the SAT expression and the CNF formula and RG, right? Then I'm going to run logic synthesis.
So that's that is a 17 variable.
That's a 20 variable SAT problem. Yes, exactly. It's from the database that they call UF20. They have about 1,000 problem instances. And then they've got SAT problems with a very number of SAT variables. Okay. So I'm just going to run logic optimization. For some of the problems, by the way, the logic optimization will tell you that, in fact, it's on SAT.
Yes.
Okay. Those are the really easy problems. Well, actually, they shouldn't be in this database, but this database has a timestamp, I think, of roughly 1991 or 1992. So it's possible that the runtime would have been too long in 1992, so they were hard then, but maybe they're no longer hard. Right? So yeah, so some of the SAT instances, it turns out that logic synthesis will already tell you, oh, it's 0. So we're done. I don't have to do any work. But it turns out that it doesn't for almost all the instances. Okay, so we're going to run standard logic optimization, right? You just give this to my logic synthesis. So far, so good? Yeah. So now I'm going to get a collection of gates And the gate topologies, whatever they are, I don't know what it is, but I have good confidence that Xilinx is making money, right? So they have mapped lots of these logic synthesis outputs to their FPGA, so we know that they can handle these topologies, right? So, and this is actually a real thing, okay? So if you look, the evolution of logic synthesis, place and route, and the FPGA architecture, they're all tightly coupled, it turns out. Okay. Sorry. Oh, sorry. Is the inverse problem well posed? Sorry, there's a question here. How do you know the solution exists and can be computed? Well, you don't know. If you know the solution exists, then I already have the answer to that. So that's also an NP-complete problem.
So in the worst case, the formula you get is
yeah, sorry.
The worst case, if you run it, you won't recompact the expression, will still be long, right?
Oh, it wouldn't be long. Don't worry. Yeah, absolutely.
So the logic optimization you want to.
It's not really going to reduce the size of the problem at all.
It basically takes this multi-variable function and composes it into smaller units.
Correct. You basically does logic synthesis. If I look at it, you get gates.
Gates.
Yeah.
How many inputs?
So that now I get to tell it what gates.
Yes.
That's the next step. Okay. So it turns out that you can figure this out. So not all 2-input gates can be implemented as a single Ising problem. Okay. For example, you can't do XOR. You should. This is basically the same thing as why perceptron can't do XOR.
Yes.
It's the same reason. Okay. So, but there's a complete logic set, right? You can do ands, ors, nots. So I'm done. Okay. So you can build your favorite logic library and tell the logic synthesis tool, please map this combinational formula to this library. Okay. Now, for each gate in your library, we can build an Ising problem, okay, whose minimum is met only when the constraints of the gate are satisfied. Like the output is in fact the OR of the two inputs.
Which is equivalent of training and neural network to learn it.
For example, but I mean, it's a simple as an ideas. Yeah, exactly. Right? Yes.
So once you do this mapping to the Ising gates, now it's bidirectional?
Correct. Yeah. Right? And you have to be a little careful. You have to actually make sure that all possible satisfiable solutions for this gate have the same Hamiltonian. Otherwise, it doesn't compose. Okay. So for each gate in my logic synthesis output, now I know what the minimum Hamiltonian value is. So one of the cool side effects of this mapping is I know the optimum in a minimum energy solution, what the Hamiltonian value is. So I can see how I'm doing. Right? So I've constructed an Ising problem that is NP, that is hard, where I know the answer, which is pretty nice. Okay. Is that good? Yeah.
So really, let's say if we want to write Tapeout, right? You have to somehow still give the flavor of how the logic synthesis is going to introduce auxiliary variables.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
You can't just say that the learning should get this for free, so we can just use this. No. So there must be a procedure that you prescribe, like you go from 3 sat to a 2 sat, or 3 sat to a decomposition of two variables.
So well, we could talk about, but the problem is this is all empirical, right? So basically the only thing we can really show is that, look, we can map everything. So we didn't fail on any of the problem instances, right? So that's all we're going to say, really, right? I mean, if you want me to try to argue why this intermediate variable is good, I mean, there's like 40 years of logic synthesis literature that you'll have to explain. I mean, I don't know how you do that.
So, but you must include some constraints, right? So do this in like timing constraints.
You don't need to. I mean, you could if you want. Doesn't matter. What we try to just do is minimize the logic debt.
This is not just logic debt.
Yeah, we just try to minimize the logic debt. Okay, that's kind of what we're doing.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's fair.
Well, it's the new version of ADC.
Right.
So once we do that, we done the logic synthesis and say, I have a library of Ising gates where I have known mappings to Ising problems, then I get a netlist that kind of looks like this, with my Ising gates 1, 2, 3, etc. with new temporary variables. There's an expansion of the variable count. I'll show you what that looks like. Okay, so you can just, but I can just run this through a separate existing tools, open source tools. Next, for each gate, I have my Ising mapping. So then, of course, you have fan out, so there could be multiple couplings between the same two spins, so you have to consolidate all the weights. Okay, and you do that. And I basically, sort of a variable that fans out to multiple gates. There could be multiple, extra weights I have to connect to it. I get fan in, I get more connectivity than just the simple gate connectivity and the gate topology, right? So you have to consolidate all that and get the final answer. So this is not going to be quite the same, obviously, as the graph I had between my logic gates, but it has a lot of, it's very tightly related, okay? So that's an intuition. I would expect this has slightly higher fan out than I would see in a normal logic synthesis flow, but that's fine. That I know how to, the interconnect can be parameterized, can be increased to account, okay? But this is the nice part, we can tell how well we are doing with your Ising solver, okay, which is again very useful, Okay. Yeah.
No, I mean the Ising correct binary
right.
And so basically it makes sense.
Yeah.
That's really what it is.
So this is essentially what we have. Here's a CNF file format from SATlib, and you basically just have like basically a script, a flow that just goes from there. And it says, okay, I took this 20 variable formula, I converted it into a 203 variable formula with 203 spins. And it's going to be SAT when the cost is minus 546. Okay, that's the output of this. Here's my graph. This is a standard file format for a graph. It's like, node weight, basically. Okay, this is one of the standard file formats.
But can you change this to max? Like if it's all clauses cannot be satisfied,
Yeah.
What's the best combination?
Yeah, sure. Well, actually, this one we don't know if it can be satisfied or not. I don't know. I mean, this is just a formula. I don't know if it's satisfied.
But then you can't. The Hamiltonian that you said, you are just looking at whether it's improving this.
That's correct, right? So, but this says that this is the best you could possibly do on this if it happened to be SAT. Exactly. Okay. So we did all of this. We picked a routing architecture, and then we ran all the entire placement flow and everything. And now I'm going to show you statistics across roughly 1,000 benchmarks from one of the SAT library benchmark sheets. Okay. So I can tell you the first thing is we later routed all of them. Okay, the placer runs in a few seconds. Because this, from an FPGA perspective, this is a small problem. Okay, because they're used to placing millions of gates. For us, thousands is already way beyond the capability of what a normal machine can solve for Ising. So we are not stressing these tools, which is great. Because like you said, the placement problem is also an NP-hard. Optimal placement is an NP-hard. So I can replace one NP-hard flow with a bunch of other NP-hard things. So here's how many spins we need, and what we do is we try different libraries. So you can check, all possible 2-input gates. If a library only has NANDs, or you've got OR and NOT. So basically, if you use sort of the library with the most gates, you get the fewest spins, which would make sense. But essentially, we can map. These are the number of problems from the SAT benchmark suite, and this is sort of the just some buckets of how many spins one needed. So you see roughly a sort of a factor of 10 expansion, if you like, in the number of spins.
So again, back to the gates, what's the limit on the number of inputs of the gate?
There is no limit, it's up to you, right? But as soon as you have...
in your case, how many?
In this example, we just use 2-input gates, just to see how whether it works at all. Yeah. In fact, we are currently trying to figure out what is the better gate library and things like that. Okay, but yeah. We just try 2-input gates just to see.
What does that mean when red is big and yellow is small?
Oh, okay. So the way to look at this is look at the blue bars together, the red bars together, and the yellow bars together. This is just a distribution of how many problems needed how many spins. That's it. So what this says is if you have a rich library with all the 2-input gates, you need fewer spins. Okay. But it's actually kind of interesting because if I have a NAND which has only one gate, this has 2 gates, it's OR and NOT. The NAND actually needs fewer spins.
So a NAND, basically this tells you a NAND is as good as anything.
No, not as good as having all the 2-input gates, but it's pretty good. So but this is a trade-off, right? So that is not looking at what, there are other things you will trade as well, and I'll show you that next.
I have two numbers in the square brackets.
Oh, this is the range of spins.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, I manually pick these ranges so that like you can see sort of where the set mass of most of these things are. This is much more interesting. This is the connectivity. So given a spin, how many other spins are in this particular synthesis for the Ising problem? So if I use, so here you see some of the disadvantages of using a 2-input library. There are some spins with a very large number of connections. Okay. Oh, we actually modified the way the logic synthesis flow works to now cut this down. Anyway, but most of the problems, if you look at the node degree, it's basically less than 10. There are a few outliers, but most of it is like, you know. And we've actually pulled this distribution in by changing some logics. So the person who's the author of work of ABC is actually working with us. So he was like, oh yeah, do this. And so we changed the synthesis script, and these numbers now look more like this, which is nice. Why? Because I have to support these many weights per spin. That's straight area. Okay. Yeah.
So do you think this feature would also scale not to the set, other problems which is not set?
Yeah. So we are already running those experiments as well. Yeah. Yeah. We don't know yet. For some of the problems, it definitely doesn't scale. So we think we're going to basically need two flavors of these architectures. One's where the connectivity is sparse, and that's one bucket. There's a class of problems where it looks like that. And then there's a class where the connectivity really looks dense. And for that, we actually have a whole bunch of other strategies to try to fix it. But yeah. But the real problem is if it's dense and it's large, you can't do it. So you've got to figure out something around that. And then this is another interesting statistic, and this is how many bits of resolution do I need for my weights? Because again, this is the complexity of the coupling weight circuit, right? How programmable I need to be. But this year, at least for SAT, the news is really good. I mean, I need like less than three bits or less of precision in my weights. That works. Okay, so that's a perfectly feasible thing. It's not like 16 bits of precision in the weights. Right? And all of this is basically related to the way we constructed the Ising instance from SAT.
So it's me.
Names,
the zero.
Oh, zero is just means plus one or minus. There's always a sign. Yeah. Yeah. So the zero is not represented. Because that's a missing connection. Right. Yeah.
This may be jumping around, but so why don't you have to go to an Ising spin model? Why can't you actually run the gates and find a solution direct from the gates?
But I mean, but that's what a SAT solver does, if you want to think of it that way, right? I mean, the SAT solver is basically trying to run your gates back.
The problem is you can't use the output of the gates to get the input, right?
Yeah, I mean, you have a choice, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's what Max event approach augmented computing is, right? So you have this reversible gate. We have a logic gate, and you can go back and with current setup.
This is being recorded.
Also something like
keep on out. But yeah, I mean, if you had a way to reverse the gates perfectly, then sure, you can solve the problem like that. But you know, whoever actually, if that was actually true, you wouldn't be having this conversation.
By the way, where you have one bit of magnitude, is that really resolved to something that's asymmetric?
No, it's not. This is I'm looking at. I think I pulled out the sign bit. So there's always a sign bit.
And so the way is either half or one.
Yeah, yeah. No, so here it's like basically you have integer weights here, right? Something. I mean, you can rescale everything you want, right? But it's basically your 0, 1, 2, 3. It's basically 0 is no weight, so I'm not even counting those. So 0 plus 1 minus 1, or minus 2 to plus 2, minus 3 to plus 3, etc.
Yeah, minus 4 to plus 4.
Exactly. Yeah, that's it. Pretty simple. Yeah. So technically, there is one more bit, which is the sign bit attached to each of the bits. This is the resolution of the magnitude. Yeah. And then you can actually run place and route and then ask how many routing channels do I need to make this work? Right. So this is an example of running one of the open source place and route tools. We had to do a bunch of fun things to make it think it was routing a normal logic net list, that's fine.
There was some pads on the edge or something.
Yeah, there are pads, there are, I can get into a lot of, I don't need any pads, right? But if you don't, if there are no pads, the tool fails miserably. Let's just put it that way. And I can tell you why that is, because of the way the placement algorithm works, but yeah. So we can now run all the benchmarks and see how many routing tracks do I need to make this like 1,000 benchmark suite router. Right? And so we did that. Oh, what are bits of coupling? I hope I answered that. That's the number of bits needed to represent the weight. And here are the number of, so this is how many SAT problems will place and route given a certain number of routing tracks. Okay, so this is sort of the CDF, right? Yeah.
What is actually the routing track?
So the way FPGA routing works, sorry, this is our FPGA lingo. A routing track is one wire, okay, in the horizontal and vertical direction, and then you can have a number of such wires, and then you can connect to each of them, and so there's some parameterized interconnect.
So on each port, like north, south, east, west, you would have.
No, it's not the ports, because the ports you have some fixed amount based on the fan-out distribution. But then it's how many wires do I get to use to try to build my routing graph. So it's just the interconnect.
I see. And the logic block is connected to 90 on each side? Or?
Okay. Well, so no. So if you did that, the diarrhea would be prohibitive. So there is some subsetting of the routing architecture. So not everything is connected to everything else. So for example, you could imagine a particular output pin connects to every 4 of the tracks, every fourth track. So there's a decimation of the connectivity as well. I mean, I just pick parameters that I know are implementable. I mean, that's a whole other thing to keep trying different options. But I mean, I kind of have a good idea of what's good. So I just put that.
It depends on the fan out.
Yeah, it depends on the graph you're trying to embed, right?
Yes, graph.
Yeah.
But in the switch box, you would have the 19 times 19 crossbar.
No, you don't. No. That would be prohibitive.
But a subset of these switches.
It's highly depopulated. It's in every place where you see n square crossings, there are only ordered n switches.
Okay, but it would be 19 wires coming on top
That's
down,
right.
19 wires.
That's right.
Okay,
That's
okay,
right.
thanks. Yeah.
But not everything can talk to everything. And that's why you need more tracks, because you have to pick a track that can talk to the tracks. So yeah, that's what I mean by this whole thing is co-optimized. This is actually a very complicated exercise, which is why it's nice to steal 40 years of research and to say, hey, this works. Let's move on. And then we can make it better, but at least we have a good starting point. Right. And it turns out that this is actually a pretty reasonable number of routing tracks. There's usually an extra 0 in that number for normal FPGAs. So 5x basically. So this is totally, you can build this.
But Rajit, isn't there a flavor of like type of so meaning it's not like the standard logic synthesis. Like you have to make sure that all the connectivities have equal delays, right? You want to
yeah. So how do you deal with the delay? Oh yeah, that's a whole other conversation. So there are a bunch of things you have to do on the circuit end to deal with the delays. There's a combination of things you can do with placement and with having a small amount of programmability at the endpoint. So it turns out that we found that the degree distribution doesn't dramatically change as you increase the problem size, that's good news, at least for this kind of mapping strategy. So it's actually possible to even add local delay lines to compensate as well. So yeah, there are lots of things you can do. But yes, you have to be, the easiest thing you can do is just run it slowly. Then the delay of the interconnect is, you can pretend it's noise. Compared to the actual delays of the oscillator. But,
so you design this and you really solve the problem at the design phase. Now running the Ising, the speed models is kind of trivial.
Well, yes and no, right? So all I will say is, if we really understood how all of this stuff works, then I agree with your statement. Yeah, so if I use in a deterministic way, if I build this graph and I just say go, I get my answer, yes, you are absolutely correct.
And you decompose the graph again, do it again, iterate, right?
Yeah, there are various things you could do. But yeah, I mean, so at least now we know, that we can actually build these things and make them programmable. And I'm kind of out of time, which is perfect. So this is work I've been doing with Rajit, Roy Chaudhary at Berkeley. So we kind of, I hope I've convinced you that it's actually tractable to build these things. I only said I can help you build them. I didn't tell you that they're going to work. But at least they will be programmable in a sufficiently rich way. Okay. I'm not going to constrain myself to some small set of graphs, but it's actually pretty reasonable to do. And the key idea here is basically, the usual thing, right? Standing on the shoulders of giants. Okay. So it just works. Yeah.
Cool. So basically, if you want to take a bit of silicon space and get free silicon, free for you, not free for us, then this is a great opportunity. I'm going to show of hands how many people have dabbled with Verilog before. Okay, so about half. I'm not going to go through a Verilog tutorial, but I'll kind of go through coding a leaky, integrate and fire neuron together. And hopefully that will just give you a bit of intuition on what Verilog looks like. There's a point of digital design as it currently stands, the standard cell flows, something to the effect of you write what looks like code. Really, it's a hardware description language because your language is describing hardware. And then every single construct in that language. So say I have A plus B, that plus is some operator. Every single thing in that language is going to map deterministically to a piece of a bunch of transistors. Right. So what is a plus? An adder. Maybe it's a 1-bit adder, 2-bit adder, 4-bit adder, etc. Like this is stuff that you specify. It depends on how many bits A and B are. Now that plus is going to instantiate a standard cell. The standard cell is just a bunch of transistors. Some other guys have gone and laid out quite painstakingly using geometry and physical shapes, something that will ultimately lead to an envisioned operator. So you end up writing a bunch of hardware. You write up a bunch of your HDL, hardware description language, to get some operation. All of these operations and variables are all going to be mapped to physical structures, adders, multipliers, multiplexers. Like an if-else statement is basically a multiplexer. If that doesn't make sense, don't worry too much about it. The point is there's a small set of standard cells, there's something like 30 to 100 of them. And everything in your Verilog HDL or VHDL is going to map to some hardware, right? Then it's all going to be compiled into some chip space, what you see here. And you'll see a bunch of rows. This is what hardware logic gates need power. So you've got alternating power lines and ground lines, and you're just putting all of these standard cells, your adders, all of these pieces in this kind of uniform fashion, such that it's got a pathway from power to ground so that your circuit actually works. Through some optimization processes, it's going to take these standard cells and wire them up somehow. So that's like a very coarse overview of the digital design flow. In typical designs, what you often have to do is, beyond standard cells, you also have to instantiate what are known as macros. So often memory circuits come under that class of macros. Design of memory circuits is a little bit more specialized. So just go to your vendor. If you buy a particular memory cell that you want, or you use a memory compiler, or you say how much memory you want in maybe Python or some other high-level language, and that's going to spit out a physical structure, a physical layout of an SRAM. So what we're going to do today is look at how we can compile this, some design into standard cells, and then we'll be able to take one of these small little blocks on a much larger chip. So I think this is like a 250, there are 350 designs on this one chip, and we're welcome to take one because all multiple. Now with Tiny Tapeout, this presentation was originally given by Matthew Ben, couldn't make it, so kind of giving it on his behalf. He's also designed a tool called WhatQi, which is an online browser that lets you schematically draw your circuit. So you can throw in an AND gate, OR gate, you can create your own functions. And then in the background, while you're doing all of that, it automatically compiles all of your Verilog, which then gets compiled into physical standard cells, which make physical sense with geometries because transistors are physical shapes and structures. And then that's what ultimately gets put onto your chip. So with that being said, just going to go through a quick overview of what this tiny tapeout nonsense is, and then we'll actually go through doing some design together. So this is a screenshot of WalkWe, an online simulator. You don't need to download anything, and it exports your physical schematic into a Verilog net list, which is really nice. And there's a bunch of examples on there, which is also kind of cool. So the way you go about this is open up walkwe.com, sign in. You know what? I'm not going to bother with this because we're not going to use WalkWe, but you can go ahead and use that, and I'll show you the link where you can find some tutorials if you want to go down the WalkWe route. The reason that this is all possible is because process design kits have typically been very closed source, and as of 2020, Google threw a whole bunch of money in order to open source process this one particular process design kit, Sky 130 process, where the rough J's length of your transistors between 130 to 150 nanometers. And a bunch of the tools have been all completely open source, so you can literally make a design and get some physical structure at the output, which is going to be saved in this format called a GDS2 file. That GDS2 file is what you send off to your foundry. The foundry makes sense of all of these shapes, and then they fabricate a chip based on silicon processes. So a few examples of what's gone onto tiny tapeout in the past. It's binary to decimal converter that only required 25 standard cells, 8-bit counter, 4-bit counter, and a BCD. So you can get some pretty cool stuff, even though they're basic. You can get some cool stuff within a small space. And I think you have something like 1,000 standard cells to play with. So what are we looking at here? If you want to get started on this, we'll be forking project template, and then we'll modify the template. You can update your config file in order to point to the design that you're working with. You're going to, typically with chip design, you need to run a whole heap of tests. You need to make sure all of these tests pass. You have to compile your design into some format. Thankfully, these guys have written GitHub Actions that do all of that for you. So it's a reasonably trivial process. Every one of these blocks is 160 by 100 microns in size. And if you so desire, you can hit me up and say, yo, I want 2 designs, or 1 by 2 arrays, or 2 by 4 arrays. So there's a certain number of permissible tile sizes that you're allowed to have. Obviously, that costs a little bit more for us, but also if your design is interesting, if there's something creative you want to play with, then by all means, let me know. I would love to let you play with it. Okay.
But now with the slots, if you have 2 slots, you don't get more inputs and outputs, right? So input and outputs, it is fixed.
I believe, yeah,
I get more gates.
Yeah, I believe they would be fixed. Yeah. So yeah, 1,000 gates, you have 10 ins, 8 outputs, 8 bidirectional, and those 8 bidirectional can be specified after the back. Don't need to install or download anything. Really easy to share your design to the 3D viewer and Explorer. So a lot of cool things to play with.
So, Jason, before this slide was your color book that takes the design and produces later?
No, we'll get there. Yeah, this is just preliminary stuff. Yeah, tiny tapeout, Matt Ben's project. Presenting on his behalf, I'm just going to give you a quick run through of how to do something. Yeah. So yeah, if you want to get a little bit more documentation, just type in tinytapeout.com. There's for those of you that want to get deeper into Verilog, that's where you can go. Be able to add designs, some specs, 50 megahertz designs, going to basically use a scan chain to indexing to your design. And what's kind of cool about this is that every single person's design is accessible to you as well. So everyone's going to be documenting this stuff. You're going to list out all of your IOs, what the function of your design does, and then you can go ahead and play with everyone else's stuff. So that's kind of neat. The deadline for this is September 23. And this, you were to follow this hyperlink, I'll post it in the Slack in a sec. You can go ahead and walk some stuff and get started. And either go with QFN, wait for level chip scale packaging, and then it ends up on a board, and that's powered by a USB-C supply. So it should be pretty straightforward, and a lot of the pains are going to be abstracted away from you. So this is very much an interesting educational exercise. Yeah, I don't think we need to go too much into detail there. Simon.
How much will it cost to create such a board after the workshop? Oh,
so you don't need so we're underwriting the cost for you for for a single cell, well, not a cell, but for a single that's going to be $50. For that to be put onto a board, $100. I think we have funding for something like $2,000-3,000. So I think that's more than enough for everybody. Yeah. Not sure if it's enough for boards for everybody, but
Right.
Yeah, it's fine. Okay. Just figure that out.
One board would be like $200, that's $200.
Oh, no, $100. Yeah, and then that includes a design as well. Yeah, it's cheap. Yeah, 250 designs, and so everyone kind of pulls in, and then it's a neat way to do this.
So if you were to do it by yourself, how much it would cost this?
If you wanted to get a full chip,
Right.
if you're getting tiny tape out, that's something like $10,000.
$10,000, right. Okay.
So eFablets really like the amount of PR that tiny tape out's getting, so they're sponsoring this project, and this money basically goes to support Matt and his team to build all the tools and GitHub actions that make it happen. So yeah, how would we get started? I'm going to go ahead and copy this link into the Slack channel. Where is my Slack? Don't worry, Hugo. Where's Hugo? There he is. I'm so confused. Anyway, so GitHub tiny tape out, Verilog demo. Let's open that up. Is anyone following along with this, by the way, or should I just kind of flag through it? Okay, I'll go slower if people are following. I'll flag through it if people are not following. Hands up if you're following along.
I mean, why?
I mean, if you're coding along, that's fine. They're just following along with their notebooks and their brains. Let's see. Okay, so this is on the Tiny Tapeout repo, TTO4, that's Tiny Tapeout 4. They had 3 iterations prior to this. There are a couple of different template notebooks. There's a separate template notebook if you go through the WAPWE route, where you actually do some schematic entry. Verilog is cool, so we'll go with the Verilog demo. And what I would do is go forth, and then because I've already forked this, I can't fork that again, but we'll go ahead and do that. So I'm just going to go into my own Git repo and open this up.
And just a detail.
Yeah.
Does this have to be public or it can be private? This repo.
I believe it would have to be public.
It has to be public, so you have to create a public. You cannot use your own repo. I guess it could.
So I'm not, I think that's a gray area question right now. If you were to go through the Google store, Google Docs or anything right now, that has to be open. But with Tiny Tapeout, I think it needs to be public because they compile all of your documentation and have one homogeneous notebook that everyone can follow along, right? So everyone that buys this chip or buys any state, they should have access to it.
So you need to create kind of a Git. Yeah. Your public Git that put all your public shit there.
Basically.
Is it enough to just give your top level, say GDS and your top level net list?
That's a question for Matt. I'm not sure how long it's going to handle private notebooks. I mean, private repos. Yeah.
And then you probably should go through
Yeah. So this is not Google sponsored. This is eFablets sponsored. They're underwriting the cost of it, but then we still have to pay for individual designs. Yeah. Okay, so the first thing that you would have to do is enable GitHub Actions and enable GitHub Pages. So that doesn't automatically take place. So super simple, right? Just follow the 1 and the 2, right? Click Actions and then press that button, right? Go up here. Actions, I've already done it, so you can see how many times I failed, but we eventually got there. And then secondly, you would also need to ensure that your GitHub Pages can be built. So settings, pages, GitHub Actions, so settings again, pages, and then from building deployment and source, it should by default, it will send you to deploy from a branch. Instead, you want to deploy from the GitHub Actions. Matt's putting a lot of time into making this all work by GitHub Actions, so you don't need to download it. It's kind of neat. Now I've gone ahead and cloned this original repo. Let's see. Yeah, there we go. So I cloned the original repo. And how do we feel about that? Can we see these? Yeah. So all of your Verilog files are going to end up in your SRC file. We'll go through that and spend a bit of time in there in a sec. Info.yam. Now, if you're using WAKWI, you're going to have a URL that's automatically generated, and you can literally see it, bright, colorful letters. You would copy paste that and insert that here in your info.yaml file, such that this file points to your design question.
I just didn't know how you. What's the difference between this Verilog repository and WAKWI?
Yeah, so WAKWI is going to involve you making a design in an online schematic editor. Let me pull up what that looks like. So something like this here, that you're going to manually draw logic gates, and in the background, your Verilog netlist is going to compile without you having to touch Verilog. I think that's fine for really simple designs. If you're comfortable with Verilog, go with that. If you're not comfortable with Verilog, I don't honestly still just go ahead with the Verilog. Yeah, like there are no adders, multipliers in there. All they have a combination of logic, registers, and muxes. Everything kind of has to otherwise be built from scratch. Okay. But then, yeah, you make that design in WAKWI, you save it, you make an account for all of that, and then just by virtue of copy pasting the unique identifier of that WAKWI design, that's immediately going to tell the GitHub Actions, look over here, we've already got a design online. That's it. So it's actually very, very elegant in that sense, but you're very constrained to doing so. Designing with Verilog would probably be a little bit faster. So yeah, then next thing you want to do, which we haven't really figured out yet, but you go into your source files, you list out every single Verilog file and your top level module. So you're going to have some Verilog file that calls a bunch of other Verilog files, unless you're lazy, would dump everything into the same file. These are pretty small designs, so there's a good probability that you'll go ahead and do that. In terms of design sizes, 1x1 tile. Now, if you want to use one of these, so 8x2 would end up being considerably larger. I would recommend, if you do want something large, I'd recommend you letting us know sooner rather than later, so that we can factor in the 8x2 cost. And I would think that
what is 1x1, 1x2?
Yeah, 1x1 is by default going to be 160 by 1. Yeah, you're scaling those two dimensions. Yeah.
Yeah, we are including the kind of the frame that they want to use, or like, do I have that actual area, or?
Yes. Yeah, that's the area that you have to put your core into. Forget about the frame. You don't. Yeah, that's stuck. Yeah.
Put scale too.
Yeah, we had that question earlier. I don't think so. Yeah. Anything else? How do you connect inputs and outputs? Wonderful question. We're going to get the. Then you go ahead and fill out your documentation. Pretty trivial stuff. Just follow the comments, and then that's all. Well and good, right? Maybe you can fill that. Life you can fill that. So if we go into our source, I'm just going to open up everything one by one, give you a feel for what's going on. So cells.b, that's a Verilog file, purely for the purposes of WAKWI-based designs. Each of these modules are telling WAKWI what Verilog to compile your schematic. So we're going for WAKWI. To be honest, even if you're going for WAKWI, you don't need to pay attention to this. It's just all happening in the background. Got a config file. Please do not edit. So I'm just going to move on. Now, then we go into our actual designs, right? So this is not the design in there by default. I have gone ahead and I think that there's the default design is a 7-segment decoder intended to light up an LED display. So I mean, maybe I'll be risky and delete everything and kind of go through this. So yeah, you know what? Show of hands. Who wants me to just talk about what's going on, or who wants me to write it out and talk it out loud? Who wants me to show? Who wants me to like take a plunge and write from scratch? All right, one person. That's enough for me. I'm going to copy and paste this because I'm inevitably going to fuck this up. Yeah. Okay. So what you want to do? Okay, module as well. The first constraint is that your module, your top level module, is must start off with tt_um_ whatever the hell you want. So that's what the GitHub Actions don't search for. Something that points to tiny tapeout. Next, all of these. The reason I had a bunch of failures in my previous GitHub Actions was because I was not using the appropriate variable names for connecting inputs and outputs, right? So yeah, UI, and this is all in the default template. So you don't need to memorize any of this. You just take it for granted that this is a bunch of your inputs. You have 8 inputs here. I believe I did say that you have 10 inputs in the PowerPoint slide. So 10 inputs. Yep. So you are at liberty to go to change that to 9. I think in the previous iteration of Tiny Tapeout, you only had 8 inputs, right? And so that's why this is not been stated yet.
So you don't include the clock and reset and enable.
Those are separate, yeah. Great question. Those are separate to your IOs, yeah.
So basically, every design would have the same. Like this would be
yes.
Yeah.
Keep that the same. I try to change it. GitHub, So yeah, your outputs. Then this is your bidirectional reconfigurable inputs. This is your bidirectional reconfigurable outputs. Keeping in mind that you can't access both of these at the same time. You have to enable one or the other on a per bit level. And that's what you do with this. So IO enable. Then this is just some single bit variable called enable. You activate that high when your design is enabled, right? Because there's another 250 or so designs on the same chip. So we've got to index into your particular design and enable go high when your chip is active. You have a clock because I do a clock-based rising interface design, and then a reset signal, low to reset. So it's kind of nice that those signals don't eat into your 10 ins, 8 outputs.
What's the difference between UI_in and UIO_in?
Yeah, so you have 8 pins dedicated for ins. You have 8 pins dedicated for out. You have 8 pin bidirectional.
Oh, I see. You have 3 sets of 8 pins.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. That's a lot of wires.
That's a lot of wires, yeah.
So actually, these addresses, UIO in and UIO out are the same wires.
Yeah, and then you use OE to select whether you're going to be going in or out. Yeah. Cool. Otherwise, I'm not sure what happens when they're not selected. Perhaps that goes right. Yeah.
And IOs, they are basically just mapped to a bus when your design is selected, or is there a way for different designs to talk to each other as well?
There is no way for different designs are isolated from each other.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, no. Yeah. For all intents and purposes, they're isolated room.
So for the UIO, you can select in and out for each wire, or they have to be.
Yeah, for each wire. So it's, yeah, and that you can kind of get the sense because that's you're indexing from 0 to 7. So each one of those 8 wires is basically going to be selected independently. Okay, right? Yeah, good question. All right, let's make some mistakes.
Sorry.
Yeah. Good. Just let's pull out.
Because these are wires, right? You can change them during runtime, like you can reassign input or how does that work?
I don't understand the question. Sorry.
Okay, I mean, you can. So can you reassign while the thing is running whether something is input or output? Like, can you change that? Like reprogram the because it's an output wire, and so you can change what's on the wire.
You can drive it that way.
You can
drive the
output. I'm not sure. We drive that, but then the output wire itself. No, I'm concerned that once it's in the context of tiny tapeout, then you wouldn't be able to do this because that's how everything around would be configured. Yeah, I designed that. Yeah, if you went through the fabulous without the tiny tapeout thing, then your pads are very generic. Whatever the hell you want with that. You have 38 of them, and you choose what to do with each one, right? In this, I'd be scared about
Usually the bidirectional paths, they get mapped to IO paths that are themselves bidirectional.
Yes.
Yeah, so that means that if you toggle IO, the output enabled from your cell, you can change the path to either be input or output. Right?
Oh, was that the question? Yeah. So that's definitely correct. Yeah. Oh, during running. Gotcha. Yep. You can play with. Yeah. No, yeah. You can effectively do whatever you want on that. Yeah. You're just stuck with. Yeah. What I was saying is this is stuck as it is. This is stuck as it is, and then these two are self-view. Cool. Leaky integrating fire because that's my entire personality. So what do we have in a leaky integrating fire? We have an input current injection. So once we assign that to in current. What is that? Let's just say that we're driving our input current from some external input, right? And we can bring that in from UI. So say UI underscore in. I don't want to waste all of my 8 input bits on input current. So maybe I'll arbitrarily set this to be a 6-bit current value. So we'll say 5 zeros.
I need to worry about timing, whereas UI didn't kind of guarantee to come like along the rising clock edge.
So you could worry about time. No. Look, sorry.
The clock, the inputs.
Oh, the input's clocked. Yes, because it's coming from something else. So the asynchronous stuff, the driving your input is someone else's problem. I would assume that your input currents are going to be. I want to say that the assumption is that your inputs are driven for a sufficiently long time, such that you're guaranteed to pull them over to your core. If you're relying on inputs that are lasting 1 clock cycle, then you're pretty well screwed. Now, the context, you're basically controlling this using switches. So you're probably not going to be able to.
You're saying switches like on the board.
Yes.
And so in that case, you want like a metastability shift register or something like that.
Someone else is taking care of that.
Okay, so the point is synchronize the clock. Go somewhere else on the board.
On the basis of it being a mechanical switch, you're not going to be switching something for 1 clock cycle. Is my point. Therefore, you don't even.
Okay.
You have to assume.
But I still heard about the edges, right? Like that edge could occur right when like a rising edge.
And if it does happen, because it's a mechanical switch, it's going to stay high for a bloody long time.
Right. Also like bounce or things like that too, right?
No, why is I think they have a debouncer on the.
Yeah. True. Yeah, Matt, then go through the sign.
Yeah, I think they have a debouncer on the.
The boards get plugged into a ST micro board and control it. Isn't it the same? We're doing a switch. This is going to have to be the kind of plug.
And so I can't then like it's like from the IO
or from another
Go straight from the IO. They're not IO ring latch, and then there is like around it, see the car. Right? Yeah, exactly. So if you pick from the car, right? Yes, then they're not latched. It's just the pad buffer. Wow. Actually, I don't know. Yeah, that's right. I'm not really sure if my gun is.
Yeah, it has meetings.
Because between the cargo, there is another thing. There's this, what do they call the
right?
The array thing. It's like
we're not going to program this
like because they switch
okay, it's like a routing layer around there.
They must have been like
it's like a very complicated machine.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, I'm multiplied than that.
It's like we're going to treat it like a synchronous for now.
Yeah, treat it as synchronous. It's a float clock speed. Like that's what it is, right?
But what actually happens when one of the boards is selected? Like for some period of time, a board was selected, and then during the timing, it was stream and input. Yeah. That's the other way it works.
Yeah, exactly. So,
in the time multiplexing over different boards, is that happening? Or
when you say time multiplexing, you're only selecting one board, one design at a time. Yeah. Yep. So. Okay, we've got an input current injection. Using scan change design. Then what else do we have? What else is in this leak integrated fire? We've got a spike. Let's just treat that as though we have an output spike. We'll call that. So take one of these UO out variables, maybe just non-zero, and we'll allocate So that's a spike, for example. Then what else have we got? We've got the hidden state of the neuron. Maybe what we want to be able to probe the membrane potential. If we're just going for one single neuron, so move those out. What do I want my hidden state to be? So if my input current injection is 6 bits, let's maybe do the same thing with my hidden state, my membrane potential. So 6 to 1. Keep things consistent, so that's 5 bits there. I'm sorry, 6 bits. And we call that state. Terminate that with a semicolon. Then let's see what else we've got. We want to instantiate a few more parameters, a few more variables, right? So what else is in the leaky integrate fine here? Threshold. Then cool. Threshold. So it's reg means register syntactically. Don't worry about 6-bit thresholds because we have a 6-bit state, I guess. What else do we have? We have a state. Time constant. Time constant. For the time constant, yeah, we can. I'm gonna abstract that to just be like the.
You can make it a vector.
Yeah, if you're just gonna make that a vector, some. Yep. I'm gonna just show a example where we do our vector. You know what? Yeah. Okay. This is reg. Okay. Great. Keeping in mind, if you want something super simple, then you can just do like a left shift, right shift. Is what it is actually. Now, because you're calculating your next state on the basis of a previous state, we probably want to store both values, right? So I'm going to call another variable just like state history. State hist. And then just for syntactical reasons, I'm more comfortable with high resets. So while reset, so not this. So this it's funny tapeout construct assumes that you set your reset signal to low to be active. Just gonna set up high in this line. So that is what it is. Is anything else I'm missing? Yeah.
So your design basically, this is going to be a single file, very low code.
Yeah.
For a spike neuron.
Basically, that's something super vanilla. We'll see how much space it takes. It turns out that you can probably fill up that design space with 50 to 100 of these things.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Wow. This is actually a very, depending on how you do it. So if I was to multiply my decay rate by my state, then it would no longer, the multiplier is going to take up a fair bit of space. If I was to just do a left shift, a right shift, then plenty of space. Sorry, plenty of neurons. Yeah.
So this means that the competition will occur when the clock is high, as you mentioned?
Yeah, right. So every time you call a flip-flop or a register, value at the input of that register is only going to be transferred to the output on a rising clock edge. I haven't explicitly defined that yet, but I will. Are you talking about the reset signal?
Yeah.
Okay, so the reset, that's up to me. If I take this and I say, if reset something, then that something will happen when reset is high. If I was to say, if RST underscore N, and then it's going to be the inverse case. Yeah. So let's just do some combinational logic for the membrane potential calculation. So assign state hist. So what do we do to generate our membrane potential? We take our input current, right? In current, so this guy, which is a 6-bit variable, in current, and that's going to be added to something else, right? It's going to be added to your previous membrane potential scaled by some factor, but there is also the possibility that my neuron has just triggered a spike. And if I've just triggered a spike, then I might want a refractory period, or I want to reset, right? So the syntax I'm about to show you is going to instantiate a multiplexer. Where is it? So spike, is there a spike? If so, then I'm just going to add input current to 0, right? So that 0 is kind of like resetting one part of the membrane potential. It's not going to clamp the membrane to 0, rather it's going to just add the input current to 0. Does that make sense? No. So you have a bunch of options as to how to implement a reset mechanism. You can have a hard zero. There is a spike, it just ignores any inputs coming in for the next step and just forces it to be zero. The way I've written it here, somewhat arbitrarily, you can honestly do whatever the hell you want. In this instance, it does not neglect the input current. So it does set the state to be zero at the previous step, but it takes in the present time input as well.
What's the syntax again?
So I have to finish this slide.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's basically saying if there is a spike, question mark, is there a spike? If so, if spike is 1, then I'm going to trigger a 0. Otherwise,
it's just a terminator.
I'm going to do something else. Now, something else is just going to be my state. I could multiply it by, what is it, decay rate? Right? Alternatively, I could also just left shift it or right shift it. What's right shift? I'm going to right shift it by 1 position. So go 2. Right?
Start with half it.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm scale by half. Yeah. So let me go through this line again. The new membrane extension is going to be the input current plus 1 of 2 values, either 0 if I just had a spike, or my previous membrane potential scaled by half. It's one or the other. Now,
and so that's scaling by half. That's how you the exponential decay.
It's the simplest possible thing, right? Yeah. Of course, you can change that to multiplier.
Well, no. I like scale. Shift is good.
The shift is good, yeah. There is a repo that I've got online where I have various permutations of different shifting. So shift by 1, shift by 2, shift by 3, shift by 1 every 2 cycles, shift by 3 every 3 cycles. You have various permutations so that you basically enable a vast heterogeneous number of time constants in a sense. So that's all well and good. Now let's
the variable name should be state is not state.
Say that again.
But the variable name, the last one. So why should that should be state is right?
State hit equivalent. Let me think for a second. Now but then no, so there is no register in this design.
Wow.
So I've got state hist and I've got present state, and I'm scaling the present state in order to generate the state hist. So if you were to do your approach, I would need to put that into a pos edge block. Yeah. Okay. For those of you that are not used to Verilog doing, usually doing Python and stuff, the one clincher here is that every single line is kind of happening in parallel. It's not necessarily a sequential language. So just keep that in mind. So,
okay, so if it defines the spike after this line, it just still exists. It can still access that.
Yeah, so if I was to say, for instance, just do some arbitrary computation here, assign in current, I don't know, let's say, I haven't defined these variables, but let's say I had, if I said assign C equals A plus B, both of these 2 lines would occur at the same time. If you're instantiating hardware, you're not sequentially going through the code. There are ways to make the sequential blocking and non-blocking assignments of what you want to look up, but otherwise everything is running in parallel.
So you're saying has it spiked at this time step or the previous one?
I haven't even considered this. I haven't generated a spike yet.
Okay.
Yeah, so we're about to. So every time we have a writing clock edge, we want something to happen. Right? So the syntax for that is just use pos edge clock again. So what do I do? So first, you would typically set a reset function, right? If reset, then we want to do something. At reset, I want everything to go back to a very well-known, well-defined state. So it's something like setting my threshold. I can define my threshold to be, what are we at? We're from 6 bits, 2 to the 6, that's 64. So maybe I'll set my threshold to be somewhere in the middle there, say 32. Let's make my state, it makes sense to go 0, right? And now this these non-blocking assignments going to generate registers. So all of these are also happening in parallel. Every time the rising clock edge occurs, then threshold is going to be assigned these values. Otherwise, nothing's going to happen. Whereas with this line, this is going to be continuous. This expression is going to be continuously evaluated, but it's only going to be exposed to the output on a rising clock edge because I plan on defining that here. And if we reset our state, and I guess, yeah, it's a good practice. We can also ensure that our spike is 0. I recall that spike came from the 0th index of UO_out. So we're basically forcing our output to be 0 as a result. Okay, so it's all well and good. So that's just a random reset condition. Had a question?
So if we define the code to try to change, right?
You can. Like right now, what I'm doing is actually hard coding it, which is pretty bad practice. I'm just hard coding it for the sake of brevity and getting something out as quick as possible. I would, if you were to do something nice, I would encourage you to firstly parameterize it. Secondly, perhaps at reset, you would go through a sequence of operations where, I don't know, say for 10 cycles, maybe whatever values that are passed in during those first 10 cycles at reset time are going to be your threshold. And then you can reparameterize it every time you hit reset. So I'd actually go ahead and try that instead.
But you could also read the value from the register state. The threshold is programmed because the cycle needs to be 60. Sure. Then you can also read that.
Yeah. So in practice, yeah, you would probably want to make these as configurable as your space allows. So what do we want now? We've got state hist. We want the history. We want this calculation here to be passed to our output. Where is our output? So over here, stored in state. So what I'll go ahead and do here is say.
So for the 10 IO pins, I'm going to use the 2 IO pins to build some kind of a interface.
The bidirectional IO?
Yes.
Now, I'm not going to touch bidirectional IO here just for the sake of speed, but it is reasonably trivial to just extend all of this to enable or disable. Yeah. And everything here is very, it would just be an if state. Yeah.
But you need to somewhere write the logic for getting the different configuration out there, or can you reset values somehow? Like, how do you program an evaluation first?
How do I program?
The threshold, if it's the register, like it has to somehow you need to write logic for
Everything needs to be defined. I can't just write hash parameter threshold equals 100. That's not a synthesizable construct. I would have to go ahead and say, if I would probably put it in some reset block where I'd say if reset, then I don't know, for the next 10 cycles, I would read in whatever values are coming in during that phase, and then it's kind of like an elegant part of error, like just digital design. You have to specify everything.
And so, if someone doesn't know how to code variable, you can design a circuit, a digital circuit.
You can go and use WACWI. If this gets the shit out of you, go use WACWI. Well, having said that, the Tiny Tapeout website does have a bunch of really nice exercises that can get you up to speed with just the basics of Verilog. I would strongly like it's Verilog's not a legal language, right? It's a very limited number of things that are actually synthesizable, and it's not honestly. Those constructs are not hard to learn, but for other reasons that I won't go into, it can be a painful language. It's based on how you define assign commands. Yeah, we won't go into that today. It's just like basics. So we assign the new value of this state history into our state. And then what else do we have to do? Generate a spike, right? So what can we do with our spike? We can say if our state exceeds or is equal to our threshold, then that's 1, spike becomes 1. Good. That's basically a leaky integrated via neuron. So I'm ending this line, and then what else do I have? I think I've already put that. Okay. So that's one of infinite numbers of leaky integrated via neurons that you could create. Now, assuming that you forked your repo and then you cloned it, then go ahead and push this back to Git. See what's going in the chat. Okay, that's productive. And I'll go back into my repo. So when that happens, give me 1 second. So I've gone ahead and pushed this to my fork. I'll go ahead and click actions. Then you've got a bunch of things that are going to run. So your docs are going to be compiled based on the stuff that you typed in. GDS, we're very interested in this. We'll come back to this. Pages build deployment, that's going to be compiling the document so everyone else can play with your design. And test, I haven't written any tests that are appropriate for this late integrated fine neuron. I'm not sure if that's a prerequisite for getting this taped out, but and we're not going to go through writing tests, but there is a really easy to follow page that will show you how to do that.
So you mean test page?
Yes.
Test pages.
Yeah. For context, what does that look like? Test.py. So you're using CocoTVs. This is the default test for the 7-segment display. No one is rigorously checking your tests for you. Put it that way. So you could say assert 1 = 1, and then your test will pass. And pretty bad practice. Don't recommend doing that unless you have 1 minute before the deadline.
That's the test, like when it actually see them in your works.
Yeah.
Test.
Yeah. So the test would actually give you you'd be able to plot out the values that are coming out. You could see, oh, cool, my membrane is exponentially decaying. Leakage rate of 0.5. Yeah. That is one of several ways you can simulate this circuit. So in the random event that your workflow that your GitHub action does not automatically run, there's this manually push run workflow. I've already done that, so I'll go ahead and click GDS and we'll see some cool stuff here. Scroll down.
And we're gonna get GDS now.
Sorry, yeah.
We're gonna get GDS.
Yeah. Now I've got a shit ton of warnings because I have not used a lot of things in the original template. I've not touched a bunch of IOs, and it says, cool, you've specified it, but you're not using it. Fix it. That's fine. Circuit still works. Wiring 280 microns. People care about it. Bunch of cells. What kind of cells are we using?
So this is for that design right now. You're
Yes.
using 0.7% of the available area.
Yep. Now there is always a chance. So because I did this like 55 minutes ago, there is a very real chance that all of it got optimized out because I messed something up. I can't tell you. I actually think that something would have been optimized out, but it doesn't matter. Like you do fix that in Verilog.
So this is Manohar.
Something over there. Let's go open the 3D viewer. This is actually really neat. So you can. We've got some cells that have been instantiated up in this top corner. It's done what, sorry?
So something.
Oh, right, yeah. Okay. Yeah, so you can show and hide stuff. Let's hide our metal layers. All that. You can zoom in and actually see what standard cells have been instantiated as a result. Pretty cool. Like as you hover over different sections, it's going to tell you what standard cell has been generated. So the point is, we still have a fair bit of space to play with after that. I'm not going to go into for loops and Verilog, but that's something that you can play around with. You know, one-on-one, I can give you more Verilog guidance. With that being said, the submission works. So let's say you have a design that passes tests or your actions are working. The submission portal hasn't opened up yet. It was meant to open up last week, but just let me know once you're ready, and then I can give you a code, and then we'll be able to submit everything to the website there. I also want to run through very quickly a collab notebook that I've put together. We presented it at ISCAS with Charlotte, and then one of the, in fact, I also helped me put this together. So I'm going to share this in the Slack.
When is the time?
September.
September.
So you got a bit of time. Oh shit.
It's going to be a lot of time for the planning check then.
I mean, given this, 100 gates, 1,000 gates, you'll be fine.
Don't worry.
No, you will not. So I posted this on Colab notebook as well. So let's say I'm not going to run this because it takes a little while to install your environment, but I've already output all of the files that we need to look at that we care about.
So this is open data.
Yeah,
It's the environment, the open data environment.
Exactly. Yeah. So now we're going through. I mean, it's still going through the open lane synthesis flow, but it's abstracted at a higher level through the tapeout constraint.
You didn't need libraries before.
GitHub, they were pre-installed in the GitHub. The GitHub Actions installed them directly, so you're not exposed to that. So now we are.
If you have open lane environment installed about a year ago, will this work?
If I had an open lane environment a year ago?
No, I mean, if I had it from a year ago, will this work? Or do I need to update it and put on? I mean, what bells and whistles does it need that were not there a year ago?
Right. In the you're asking specifically with the notebook?
Yes.
Couldn't tell you. I don't even keeping up.
I see.
Richard, do you have any more intel on what's changed in Sky 130? No, probably not much. They introduced 130B with RM. They changed the metal height, the height between M1 and M2, and then realized that there was a problem with it, and so they got you to design in 138 anyway.
I think that also what changed like open lane in the last year. I would assume a lot of things changed.
I honestly have no idea. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Can you actually go RM in there?
Can you use RM? So not in the digital flow, but yeah, you can. If you install the 130B PDK, then you can custom lay it out or use someone else's macros or whatever they have created. Yes. So
there's still no error in the digital design?
No, they don't have RM.
It's 138 or
let's find out.
It's
probably 8. Yeah. Yep.
No, it's 8.
It's 8. So yeah, if you want to install dependencies, you could play that. This takes a while. I go through like from the ground up and a few different examples. So the first example is just putting together an inverter. We have an input, we have an output. This no longer has anything really to do with tiny tapeout. It's just got everything to do with taking a Verilog file and seeing if it can go through the open lane synthesis flow. So we can output, how do we invert it with an exclamation mark. Flick your input, that, done. Simplest possible thing you could do. We need a configuration file. I'm going to go through what all of these mean, but if you refer to the open lane Sky 130 docs, then you get a better sense of what all of that is. You specify the die area. I've been a bit arbitrary. I'm just going to put this in because I know it works. Density, whatever. You kind of fly through that. A little bit of a schematic of what OpenLane is doing. Don't worry about that. But then, yes.
If you have a like synchronous design here and something goes in the inverter, you have to turn the clock tree synthesis on, or
yes.
Okay. And it's just set for false now, so you don't have a clock, basically.
Say that again.
It's set to false here because you don't have a clock.
Yes. Exactly. Yeah. This is just a combination of.
Would it error out? Maybe it's weird that it would still play an error out if it's true.
I have never tried. Yeah, but I would imagine. Actually, I don't know how many guardrails they put in place. Do it and come back to me. It sounds good. Or don't ever do it. That was a really cute laugh. You can specify your PDK, call your flow.tickle files. This goes on for a little while. You don't need to worry about that. Just trust me that it works. And then wrote a couple of scripts to display the layout. So this is what your combinational logic is going to look like. There's no clock involved in that, so it's all well and good. A bunch of metrics. So that's going to tell you the same stuff that you saw in the Git page on the GDS actions, where a given number of standard cells are generated, your wire length, etc. So this is where all that detail comes out. Then this is the same code as the leaky integrated fine neuron that I put together just then. And you can go ahead and do it with this as well. Just keep in mind there's a write file header so that it actually saves the Verilog file in your Colab environment. Do the exact same thing. There's no, now we have a clock port. So that's because we're now using registers. So clock trigger, rising edge trigger flip-flops. So that addresses what Mikey mentioned. Then this RM file just removes my previous run when I was running an inverter. And then I go through this design flow again. more pretty pictures. So that's going to give you my PPS2 file. Then Charlotte also designed the tiny Brunton chip. So I've also included an example of, let's say you push a bunch of Verilog files into GitHub, something perhaps more complex. It's not just a single design. How do we clone that from Git and then push that through synthesis? So you can go ahead and open this repo. Caveat, I had to remove, what did I do? I removed all calls to her memory macros because I have not installed any memory compiler or anything in this environment. Keep that in mind if that matters. This is a more complex design, something that's actually functional, something that actually can compile weights onto your network, and it's pretty well documented as well, so it's cool work. So yeah, go ahead and clone that. It's going to.
So how we will build? We will use the register files for the memory.
How do we use the register files?
So you're not going to use memory as RAM.
Yeah, this design example has no memory. It's basically a brick in the way that I'm designing it now. In practice, you would also want open down and some other macro, and then you need to configure it, but just replace calls to whatever proprietary memory Charlotte was using, and sub that out to yeah. And then yeah, you literally just do the same thing. You can probably notice that the die area has marginally expanded from before, because previously we were just doing an inverter. Now we're doing several Verilog files with a few hundred neurons, I think. And then yeah.
800 by 1 millimeter.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think it's just a matter of reading. It's kind of self-explanatory. If it doesn't make sense to you, don't touch it. Design is cool. That's the call that you're using. Then yeah, if you go through that flow, then this should also spit out all the details that you need. I did save the timing reports here as well. So I think it's worth going through. Not really. That's all like reasonably straightforward to modify the Colab environment. You're not going to be taking out anything from there, but it's a cool little exercise to get a sense of how large your chip's going to be in a Colab place. And then you can also check your critical path, which doesn't matter for tiny tapeout because you're stuck at 50 megahertz or whatever. If you were to actually go ahead and use the carriable harness and you want to put a core into that frame, let me know. I have a bunch of virtual environments that make it pretty easy to get started and save you from having to install tools. So happy to share all of that stuff as well. With that being said, yeah, they're all yours, Dad. What was that?
Did that posted like on the Slack anywhere?
Yeah. If you were paying attention, then you would have seen posted it in front of your very eyes.
I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. It's fine. I'm fine. Yeah.
Getting on there or
Have you tried to get on and off yet? No. Let's talk about it later. Yeah, no, that's more or less it. Like, this isn't a presentation. This is just like how to do the thing, right? So, yeah, no, I would love to see you guys give it a shot. If Verilog is daunting to you, then go ahead and use Walkway. Just do something basic and play around with some of the designs that are there. Yeah, so I was trying to learn how to code a state, which is why these guys keep coming up. But yeah, go on to tinytakeout.com. It's not discriminating. It's not. We're being recorded. So working with HDLs, there's a good list of resources if you want to go down the Verilog route. Making Ising, whereas there's something else, digital design guide. Yeah. This gives you all the Walkway stuff. So this is pretty cool. If you want to go to the schematic side, let's go through that. If you want to go through the Verilog stuff, go through the HDLs, a few videos and examples there. And yeah, please hit one of us up to try and get your designs. Yeah.
Yeah, probably that's already my like. So how many slots do you have available? How many are already like? How many do you normally want to do? Like,
so in the Google Forms, I think there was something like 15 people with designs. A few of them were very explicit in wanting larger than 1x1 slots. Flexible. I mean, there is a total of 260 design slots. I'm not that rich. No, I'm that rich, but like, I don't want to give you my money. I'll probably put in like if we got 50 designs, that would be awesome. I'd probably stick to just getting 10 boards out. And so if you wanted the board, then if there's more demand than 10 boards, then allocate it to people most financially in need, because it's the item in the board on the box. Yeah.
But it's you're not there at the moment, so
no, we're not.
It's spontaneous, say I would also.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, yeah. Great.
So if anybody wants to help me work with a high school student to design a little module of this, but when I make on a robot, to really detect the light on the left and go left, detect the light on the right and go that right, and build a little chip, and then she can mount it. One of these vehicles, what we call it, the vehicles, a very simple neural behavior.
That'd be awesome, yeah. Well, you would probably want to get the dyes in addition to the board, because then you'd want to have something light sensitive to.
Right, I mean, the board, something like turns on and you get light on the left and light on a very simple neural.
No,
that don't even need to have a state, like majority neural.
Yeah.
Anyway, if anybody is interested, I'll sit down with a student and learn how to do this. How will I learn it?
Yeah, we submitted that this year. What are the odds we have it for next year?
Or next century.
Next century, Yep. You're going to be a grand. No, so Ethablis are claiming 6 months. In the past, more like 12 months.
Yeah. Even for that tiny thing, that's.
Yeah.
And this is really not going to
Oh yeah. No, there's nothing special.
It's still
Yeah, but now that they've actually ironed out a bunch of the errors and the regulations and MPWs are working. Yeah, I think that it's going to hopefully go back from 12 to 6 months. If, Cool. Anything else? Sweet.
We use the test pipe like run different inputs through our thing and test it as much as you can.
Exactly. Yeah. There's a lot of different ways to do that. I can run you through that one.